Improvise, adapt, and overcome.
2 Chinese defense ministers just got sentenced to death. Let that sit for a second. Not colonels, not logistics officers, not some mid-level procurement rat who got caught taking envelopes under the table. No, 2 former defense ministers, Wei Fenghu and Li Shangfu. Both men sat near the heart of China's war machine. One came out of the rocket force, the branch responsible for Chinese missile deterrent, nuclear, and conventional. The other came out of the weapons procurement system, the pipeline that feeds the PLA its ships, its missiles, satellites, aircraft, drones, and future war technology. Now, Beijing says both of them were corrupt enough to earn death sentences with a 2-year reprieve. Kind of reminds me of that Richard Gere movie, Red Corner. It's going to end differently for these two, I think. And I want you to kind of understand what that means in China when I say a 2-year reprieve. This probably does not mean they're getting dragged out and shot tomorrow morning. It means something much colder. It means they are legally alive, politically dead, clearly stripped of all rights, stripped of property, erased from the party bloodstream, and turned into a warning sign for every general still wearing a uniform. That warning says, rank is not going to save you. Retirement will not save you. Past loyalty will not save you. And if Xi Jinping thinks you contaminated the gun, he will break you in front of the entire formation. This is not just an anti-corruption case. That's the cover story, one we've talked about before. That's just the label on the box. The real issue is control, because the People's Liberation Army is not a national army the way Americans think of an army. It is not sworn to a constitution. It is not designed to serve the citizen. It is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. The gun belongs to the party. And right now, Xi Jinping is looking at that gun and asking a very dangerous question. Can I trust it? That's the story. It's not bribery. It's not headlines. It's not court language. The story is that China's top military leadership has rot inside the missile force, rot inside procurement, rot inside the modernization machine, and enough fear at the top that Xi is willing to purge men he once elevated. That matters. Because for years, the West has been told the PLA is becoming a world-class military. New ships, new missiles, new drones, new satellites, new nuclear silos, new command systems, new pressure on Taiwan, new reach across the Indo-Pacific, all of which we've talked about before. And all of that is true in many ways, but hardware is the easy thing to count. Trust is a lot harder. You can count launchers, you can count destroyers, you can count aircraft, you can count missiles on parade. What you cannot count from the outside, from our perspective, is whether the officer corps is lying upward. Does the emperor have new clothes? Whether missile units are truly ready, whether weapons contracts were bought through kickbacks, whether commanders got promoted because they were competent or because they were connected, whether the man responsible for executing a war plan is loyal, capable, sober, and clean. That is what this purge exposes. China may be building a world-class military on top of a cracked foundation. And that is not comforting, because a cracked war machine can fail, but it can also lash out. Do not make the mistake of saying China is weak, so Taiwan is safe. The sharper read is this: China is strong but uneven. It's modern but brittle, disciplined but afraid, dangerous but internally suspicious. That combination is volatile. A confident military plans. A frightened military performs. And a purged military obeys. And when officers are afraid, they stop telling the truth. They tell the boss what he wants to hear. They hide bad inspections. They polish the reports. They rehearse the exercise until it looks perfect. They mistake obedience for readiness. That is how authoritarian systems rot from the inside while still looking sharp on parade. But here is the other side of it. Xi may not be weakening the PLA. He may be tempering it. He may be burning out the old networks, the corrupt procurement rings, the factional loyalties, the generals who owed favors to the wrong men. He may be cutting the dead tissue so the force that remains is cleaner, harder, more obedient, and more willing to execute. That is what makes this dangerous. This purge can mean two things at once. Near term, it disrupts command. It scares officers. It slows decisions. It creates vacancies. It creates suspicion and bureaucratic paralysis. Long term, it may produce a smaller, colder, more loyal command structure, one that does not question orders, does not hesitate, and does not mistake political fear for moral restraint. So, when two Chinese defense ministers get sentenced to death with reprieve, do not just read it as corruption. Instead, read it as a diagnostics test. Xi Jinping opened the hood on the PLA and apparently did not like what he saw. The missile force in its entirety is under suspicion. The procurement force, well, more like the procurement system, is also under suspicion. The senior command bench is under suspicion. The modernization story is also under suspicion, and that tells us something important. Excuse me. Beijing is not preparing for peace. It is trying to make sure the gun works before the next crisis. Maybe that crisis is Taiwan. I think you know where I sit on that one. But it could also be just the South China Sea. It could be Japan. Maybe it's a blockade, a quarantine, a missile demonstration, cyber strike, or something gray zone enough to avoid war, but violent enough to change the map. And I think that map change is coming, by the way. But whatever the scenario, Xi wants a PLA that will move when told. Not debate, not hesitate, not leak, not freeload or steal from the arsenal. Move. That is the message of these sentences. Two defense ministers were turned into examples because Xi is telling the entire Chinese military the party commands the gun. And if the gun is dirty, the party will clean it with fire. Welcome to the Carry On Podcast SITREP edition for the week of May 10th. Of course, covering the week in review for last week. This evening will be long. We are going to discuss several topics, such as the CNMI Islands, Iran's ethnic groups, as well as what a possible U.S. invasion of Iran would look like. We will also take a look at the Russian co-orbital satellite that we talked about last week in greater detail. I also want to share another piece of technology my recon brothers are using. It's an electric motocross bike. It's interesting, and we're going to take a little dive into that one. We're also going to visit a country that we haven't talked about in a while, North Korea. But before we begin, a special thank you to our latest Patreon subscriber, Scar the Wolf. Nice handle, by the way. I like this. I have tried to answer all of your comments and questions on as many platforms as possible, and I'll continue to do so. Of course, don't hesitate to reach me at contact@bradcolbert.us. Contact@bradcolbert.us, or just leave some thoughts in the comments section of your favorite way to enjoy the show. I'll get around to it at some point, and I appreciate the feedback. Now, before we leave our PLA purges, let's assess some additional details in history because I think it's going to add some context. I do love to swim in the PLA's pool. So the two generals that we mentioned were not minor figures. Wei was a defense minister from 2018 to 2023. He was a former Central Military Commission member and a former commander of the PLA rocket force. That's the branch responsible for China's land-based nuke and conventional missile force. His colleague, Li, succeeded Wei as defense minister in 2023, and he previously ran the PLA's equipment development department. It's their acquisitions arm. He was deeply tied to weapons procurement and modernization. Li disappeared from public view only months into the job and was formally removed in October of 23. Both men were expelled from the Communist Party in 2024 before being prosecuted by the military legal system. Now, the sentence tells us three things. One, corruption was probably not ordinary corruption. In a system where bribery is endemic, death with reprieve is a political message. The party is saying these men damaged military readiness, procurement integrity, and loyalty at the highest level. Second, the rocket force and procurement system remain the center of gravity here. We came from the rocket force. Li came from weapons acquisition. It's not a coincidence. The purge is aimed at places where China's most sensitive military capabilities intersect with money, secrecy, and strategic deterrence. Third, Xi is not fully confident in his own military elite. A leader confident in command structure does not need to decapitate wave after wave of senior officers. And sounds strikingly familiar. Where have I heard this before? And I feel like there's something happening in America that's very similar to this. So it'll come to me. He does it because he sees rot, disloyalty, factionalism, incompetence, or all four, for all I know. Why this death sentence with reprieve matters to me? Because a suspended death sentence in China, it's a weapon of political theater and a lot of bureaucratic terror. It says to those underneath, you're legally alive, you're politically dead, and you're permanently erased. I think this sentence accomplishes a couple of things. First off, it humiliates the old command network because everyone connected to Wei and Li now know they are radioactive. I think it also gives Xi a public victory over corruption. The party can say it is cleaning the gun before it fires the gun. I like that metaphor, by the way, so you're going to hear it again. It warns the officer corps that rank will not save you, that, as I mentioned, retirement and loyalty aren't going to save you. I think it protects the system because it blames individuals. The party avoids admitting any structural rot by turning these two senior figures into sacrificial examples. I also think that it justifies future purges because once two defense ministers are sentenced this severely, and it is severely, every lower-ranking purge, much easier to normalize. The deeper military context here is, well, the U.S. Department of Defense, all the way back in 2025, all the way back last year, there was a China military report which assessed that corruption investigations had reached every PLA service and had removed dozens of general officers. The report stated that the removal of senior leaders had reduced Chinese leaders' confidence in PLA leadership, reliability, and likely had implications for China's progress towards its 2027 modernization goals. Sorry, I'm getting attacked. Get out of here. Little no-see-em. Remember, 2027 is the year where Xi Jinping intends to culminate his modernization goals. And a couple of other things coalesce in that same year, amongst them an anticipated invasion of Taiwan. But I digress. Those modernization goals are scheduled for 2027, but The report also noted that long-term effect could be improving readiness if systemic corruption is, in fact, actually eliminated. The rocket force, it's been hit especially hard. CSIS reported that all 4 past rocket force commanders had been officially purged and linked this crackdown and previous crackdowns to a lot of corrupt procurement, dating back to the branch's creation all the way back in 2015, as well as the sensitivity of the rocket force's nuclear and missile mission. That's the core of the story here. If the rocket force is rotten, then China's deterrence credibility is stained. And if procurement is rotten, China's modernization numbers could be inflated. If senior officers are compromised, Xi cannot trust the machine he spent a decade building. Looking at this from a historical perspective, I went back and pulled large, prominent leaders who were purged in the Communist Party as far back as is relevant. So we go back to 1959. Defense Minister Peng. He was purged after criticizing Mao's Great Leap Forward. Yeah, we're going to go all the way back to Mao. Mao Zedong. Read his works, by the way. It is interesting to compare and contrast. Columbia's Asia for Educators timeline notes that Peng was ousted after criticizing Mao's sponsorship of the Great Leap Forward. He was replaced with a guy by the name of Ling Biao. Now, Lin, who was Mao's chosen successor and defense minister, who died in a 1971 plane crash after being accused of plotting against Mao, the official narrative framed Lin as a traitor. Political lesson here was much simpler. No military hero was untouchable. The Mao era model was purely ideological. The gun had to obey the party, and in that instance, the party meant Mao. Fast forward to the Deng, Zhang, Hu era, professionalization of their military, but still with corruption. After Mao, China professionalized the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. It reduced some ideological chaos, focused a lot on modernization, but the system created massive corruption opportunities because you had promotions, logistics, land, housing, procurement, weapons contracts, and commercial linked enterprises all at once, rife for corruption. By the late Zhang and Hu periods, I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, and I do apologize. Somebody will troll me on that one. A lot of senior officers built patronage webs. The PLA became more modern, but not necessarily cleaner. That takes to the Xi area, anti-corruption as command and control, if you will. Xi came to power in 2012. He moved very quickly against senior PLA power brokers. CSIS notes that in Xi's first 5 years, he purged former CMC Vice Chairman Gao, Zhu, along with sitting CMC members Fang and Zhang. Gao was sentenced to life imprisonment for corruption in 2016. Zhu died before trial, and Fang was sentenced to life in prison in 2019. That was the first Xi-era wave. Remove all the old networks. The current wave, though, it's a little bit different. It's hitting Xi-era appointees. These are men promoted under Xi. They've served in his reformed PLA inside of his modernization machine. And that's what makes this much more serious, because this is no longer just Xi cleaning up someone else's mess. He's finding contamination inside his own architecture. Why these two specifically matter is we, as the missile world problem, his background in the rocket force, essentially, it makes his downfall strategically sensitive, because the rocket force, this is not just another service inside the PLA. It controls the backbone of China's missile deterrent. All of their conventional ballistic missiles, all their nukes, all their theater strike systems, and a boatload of coercive tools to be used against Taiwan, Japan, Guam, and the broader Indo-Pacific, which we're going to dive into in this episode as well. If senior rocket force leaders were taking bribes, then several questions follow. Did procurement corruption affect any of the missile quality? These are the questions that our national intelligence apparatus is currently diving into. Did officers inflate readiness reporting? Were contractors trying to buy influence? Were promotion pipelines corrupted? Were nuke and conventional missile units less reliable than advertised? See, nobody outside the black box can answer that cleanly. But Xi's behavior suggests he thinks the problem is serious enough to justify a public political execution without the execution. Lee, his prior role in the equipment development department, equally sensitive. If you didn't know, that office connects the PLA to the entire Chinese defense infrastructure, all their contractors, all their weapons programs, technical modernization, and all their acquisitions pipelines. This is the guy who was also sanctioned by the United States in 2018 over China's purchase of Russian military equipment, which made him internationally visible before his 2023 disappearance and removal. Now, his convention for both accepting and offering bribes suggests much more than personal enrichment. It points towards a networked procurement scandal. Money apparently is flowing both ways through the defense acquisition system. And I think that matters because China's military modernization, it's procurement heavy. All of these ships and missiles, these satellites and aircraft, the drone, EW, AI-enabled command system, even nuclear expansion, if the procurement is dirty, then the modernization may be fast but brittle. Taking a quick look what this may imply inside China, I think Xi is powerful, but he is not comfortable. I don't think we need to confuse purging with his calm control. I think a purge is definitely proof of power, but it also proves that he has a lot of distrust. When he can destroy two former defense ministers, it shows dominance, but the fact that he needed to do it at all tells me he doesn't fully trust his senior ecosystem, which is a bit of a paradox, right? The stronger Xi looks, the more insecure the system looks underneath him. Secondly, I think that the PLA is being politically retempered. It is not a national army in the Western sense. As I said, it's the armed wing of the Communist Party, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. Don't get that confused. The PLA is loyal to the party. It's not the state. That's different than the U.S. military and most. That regime security remains the primary lens through which Xi and the CCP view the military. And it means the purge, it's much more about absolute obedience than clean books. I think the message to all of the officers through these two is brutal. You are not warlords, technocrats, or independent professionals. You belong to the party. I think that the 2027 modernization benchmark is potentially under pressure. I think that China's public military modernization goal is to accelerate PLA modernization by 2027. And that is often interpreted by the United States officials and analysts as a key benchmark for having a lot of credible options against Taiwan by then. The Department of Defense reports states that the personal removals likely have implications for PLA's forward progress to 2027. And while it remains difficult to judge how significant the implications are, that is a careful way of saying the purge probably hurts, but nobody should bet national security on the PLA being crippled. I also think that the command bench is being hollowed out, and it's backed up. CSIS has assessed that these purges have removed leaders responsible for planning, training, and military operations, and maybe affecting more than the PLA's ability to conduct larger and more complex exercises. And, time will tell. We will see how this plays out on the chessboard. But it is operationally important because when you talk about conducting high-end war, it's not just about equipment. It is command confidence. It is integration, logistics, timing, sequencing, crisis judgment. So if a lot of these senior billets are vacant or acting frightened or politically cautious, the PLA can still parade capability, and they have, but complex warfighting becomes much harder. We've talked about this in many instances before. The PLA is modernizing their military, no doubt about it, but they do not have an NCO corps. They do not have an experienced, fighting force. They have never been tested in battle. And if these two purges represent a systemic cancer within the higher holistic, architecture of their military, they may be even less capable than we previously thought. I think that by doing this, you definitely improve discipline, but you're doing it through fear, and that degrades initiative. That is an old authoritarian dilemma. Fear makes officers obey, but it also makes officers lie upward. It makes them avoid risk. It removes and punishes candor. And basically, you wait for political permission. This is very analogous to the Germans in World War II. I think it is a recipe for disaster. In peacetime, it can look like discipline. In combat, it can become paralysis. And past is prologue. I think that there are numerous case histories that back my personal assessment of this up throughout World War II and before, if you really wanted to be honest. I think a correction cycle here has two possible outcomes. Number one, the purge disrupts command, slows confidence, complicates joint operations. It makes Xi a lot more cautious about initiating a major war before he trusts this machine. Number two, the purge creates a more obedient, politically hardened command structure that is more willing to execute Xi's orders without hesitation. Now, both can be true over different time horizons. Near term, this is most likely going to create a lot of friction. You are disrupting chains of command. You're making a lot of nervous officers. You're removing expertise. You're delaying procurement decisions now, and a lot of uncertainty inside the rocket force and the acquisition system. Medium term, Xi may emerge with a smaller, more loyal command group. That could make the PLA less corrupt, but it also makes them more politically dangerous. The United States, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, and even the Philippines should not read this as weakness alone. They should read it as instability inside a rapidly modernizing force. And that is a more volatile thing. A couple of caveats I want to mention. Chinese court proceedings in high-level military cases such as this are opaque. So the exact evidence they have, whatever the bribe amounts were, the factional dynamics, all classified. They're not public. Corruption in the CCP language, it can mean real bribery, political disloyalty, could mean faction building, poor performance, or a mixture of all four. This purge may temporarily damage readiness, but it could also produce a much more disciplined and loyal PLA over time. We're going to leave that story right where it lies. Hopefully that informed some additional details about that story. Remember, this is a follow-on to this topic that we reported weeks back when these two were publicly announced as being removed from the top levels of their command. So now we're going to switch over to Tinian. It is an island as part of the Northern Mariana Islands. I've been there. We'll talk about it in a moment. And it's interesting because Tinian is currently being reactivated as a strategic option, giving depth. You're going to hear the term CNMI. What does it stand for? Well, it stands for the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which is a U.S. territory in the northwestern Pacific Ocean. It's a group of islands. It's a group of 14 volcanic islands, including Saipan, which is really the capital. Been there. Tinian, been there. And Rota. I have not been there. Which all of these acts as a self-governing commonwealth and political union with the United States. The U.S. military, they're not just doing exercises in CNMI. They are building a more survivable Pacific posture. Joint Region Marianas reported that CNMI and Department of War leaders, Department of Defense, they met in Saipan back in December of last year to discuss defense commitment, construction updates, lease modification, and increased port visits, and a much more transparent tracking of military activity. The same report notes a $300 million purchase agreement awarded to a CNMI company for aggregate material tied to construction. The Marine Corps' revised CNMI Joint Military Training EIS, that's the key document. It says that the original 2015 plan, which we have been going off on until now, drew major environmental and public concern, and that the revised proposal now eliminates training on pagan, removes the high hazard impact area from Tinian, and it does reduce a lot of live fire and maneuver ranges from 14 down to 2. Well, that matters because the Pentagon backed off the most politically explosive version, but it didn't abandon the core mission. The revised EIS states the purpose is to reduce joint training deficiencies in the Indo-Pacific and build a much more realistic, instrumented Tinian training environment for the United States, allies, and forward deploying forces. That's quote. What does that mean? Translation: Tinian is being fitted into the new American way of war in the Pacific, which is distributed, mobile, smaller signature, and harder to kill. The revised proposal includes joint distributed operations training inside the Tinian military lease area, using sensors, emitters, a lot of comms, and a physical virtual training environment, which I'm interested to see how that's going to flesh out. Pacific Island Times, I don't know if you're a subscriber to their publication. I'm not. I actually dig that one out. Reports the current proposal includes 2 small arms live fire ranges, ground maneuver training, aviation training at North Field, and 13 landing zones. In addition to temporary expeditionary base camps, some radar towers, portable communications equipment. Okay. It took away a bunch of stuff. It removed artillery, bombing, aviation-delivered munitions, and high-hazard impact areas. All training on pagan as well is now gone. So the implication here, it's pretty blunt. CNMI is being prepared for a fight where big fixed bases are targets, not sanctuaries like they have been in the past. So Guam is the obvious U.S. hub here. Anderson Air Force Base, Apra Harbor, you have missile defense, logistics, you have submarines there, bombers, Marines nearby. But obvious hubs attract missiles. Now, Guam is great. Great diving, great prostitution, great tattoos. I actually got my first tattoo there back in, when was I first there? 2006? Or was it 2007? That is, not exactly sure, but I got 2 of them there. It is a fascinating place. It is an U.S. territory. They speak English. They use the dollar. The Chamorros are lovely people with a rich culture. But it is strategically extremely important to the United States because of the bases that we have in that part of the world on their soil. A lot of the strikes that took place with our stealth bombers were launched from there or stationed there to obfuscate where the actual strikes were being launched from. So Guam is very strategically important to us. There are other things there that are part of our global strategic umbrella. But yeah, we're not going to dive into those too much. And I'm not going to comment on my tattoos or potential prostitution that may or may not have took place in Guam. CNMI gives the United States options north of Guam. Tinian's World War II airfield, its history is not just nostalgia. It is, in many ways, geography returning to relevance. I mean, there's a reason why Tinian is strategically important to the United States, because if Guam is degraded, Tinian can absorb a lot of that aircraft, the logistics, the sustainment activity, and distributed command and control functions. It's almost like, a rear echelon area. It doesn't make CNMI invulnerable. It makes the targeting problem a lot harder for China. All of these are within China's threat envelope. I actually did a submarine insertion into Tinian many years ago. We had a harbor site inside a World War II concrete bunker right off the beach in the hinterland, and it worked great. The next morning, we were interrupted by a group of Japanese tourists taking photographs of the 6 Marines in and around the bunker. I can only assume they thought we were part of whatever tour they were on. It's very embarrassing. But the island has a rich history. Again, this is where the atomic bomb was launched. There's a pit in the runway still there to this day where the first nuclear payloads were loaded into the Enola Gay. The strategic logic in this is one big base is a target, but if you have several distributed smaller nodes acting as a network buys time, and time keeps a war from being lost in the first missile salvo. Nobody is under any illusions that Guam is going to be targeted in the opening salvo of any global war against the United States. I mean, right up there with Hawaii, San Francisco, San Diego. It's not important. Maritime security is moving up the priority list. CNMI is not only an airfield, remember, it's also a maritime domain awareness issue. The Coast Guard reported that from March 18th through the 22nd of this year, its boarding team worked with CNMI Customs and Biosecurity, CNMI Department of Public Safety, Saipan Marine Unit in joint underway and shoreside operations, all to strengthen maritime domain awareness across CNMI waters and the surrounding exclusive economic zone. There was a separate report in fiscal year 26, defense bill, which has a lot of provisions that would allow military vessels repair and maintenance in CNMI. It also directed a study on expanded Coast Guard operations to include port visits, deployments, and possible fast response cutters. Now, I think that if you look at it holistically, it tells you where this is going. CNMI is being pulled into the maritime screen around Guam and the northern approaches. I think the mission set is likely to include fisheries enforcement, trafficking interdiction, port security, disaster response, as well as a lot of gray zone monitoring. Now, in peacetime, all of that looks like Coast Guard capacity. In a crisis, another word for war, this looks like rear area security for a contested theater. China's visas, their casinos, and birth tourism issues, they're all related here because CNMI has a structural vulnerability. It needs outside money, but outside money can become outside leverage. And this is a vector that the PLA exploits ruthlessly. The Department of Homeland Security implemented the CNMI Economic Vitality and Security Travel Authorization Program. God, that's a long one. It's essentially a restricted sub-program which allows certain pre-screened PRC nationals to travel to CNMI without a visa under very specific conditions. The language says that eligible PRC nationals can travel only up to 14 days without a visa if they obtain electronic authorization, while the previous parole policy was discontinued. This program, however, it's politically radioactive. There's a bunch of senators who have urged the Trump administration to close what they call a Chinese visa loophole. And they're not entirely wrong. They're arguing that PRC travelers access these islands and that creates risks involving birth tourism, a lot of drug trafficking, and because of the proximity to Guam, illegal transport to there. Now, there is a counter-argument. CNMI needs tourism, especially after years of economic damage. But that's the trap here, because economic desperation makes security compromises look a lot like recovery plans. Now, the casino story is even worse. The Washington Post reports that Saipan's giant Imperial Palace Casino project, which was originally backed by Chinese investors, drew a lot of investigations from the United States, a lot of lawsuits, and a lot of allegations of money laundering, corruption. It was left half built. It's not finished, with huge debts to the local government. The report says that the new buyer presented himself as Japanese, but had long-standing ties to the original Chinese operators and pro-Beijing networks. All of that raised a lot of renewed concerns about Chinese influence in a strategically important U.S. territory. Sounds familiar. It doesn't prove that Beijing controls CNMI, but it does show the classic Pacific vulnerability pattern here. You've got a small island economy. You have a lot of distressed assets, foreign capital, weak enforcement, and as we've laid out, strategic geography. So that combination, it's exactly what a serious adversary would study. The economy is fragile, and it makes the security problem worse for CNMI's economy. Their economy is still overly dependent on tourism. Even now, the Pacific Island Times reported that the fiscal year 26 budget assumed $180 million in revenue, with $140 million available for appropriations. And that's before officials announced that direct flights from South Korea, which is the primary tourism market, by the way, could be suspended in March of 26. A congressional summary of the Government Accountability Office report, it warned that CNMI is at risk of severe financial crisis, with tourism still below pre-pandemic levels. Thanks, COVID. Casino and hotel closures, they worsen a lot of unemployment. They create pension liabilities. There's a lot of delays in audits and financial statements. It creates a strategic contradiction when you have something like this, because Washington needs CNMI as a defense terrain. And conversely, CNMI needs Washington as economic oxygen. We give them a lot of money. We protect them. Local residents who live there, they want jobs. They need infrastructure. They need healthcare. They need the lights to come on. They need a place to live. China-linked capital can exploit the gaps if U.S. investment is slow or is arrogant. We cannot treat CNMI like empty maneuver space. I think that's strategically stupid. These islanders are not props in some war plan. If our footprint, military footprint, grows without visible local benefit, then there's a lot of resentment, and that resentment is going to become an operating environment. The Department of Energy has also said that CNMI has an aging electricity infrastructure. It has a massively high vulnerability to natural disasters. It has almost total reliance on imported petroleum for electricity as well as transportation. It notes that the territory has no domestic crude reserves and it's very exposed to oil market fluctuations, which right now is ruthless. This is not a boring infrastructure footnote, despite how it may read. This is potentially a military constraint. This distributed posture that we talked about, it only works if each node can survive. If we do not have power or fuel or ports, roads and water and telecom, all of these collapse after a typhoon, they're not magically going to perform under some missile threat or sabotage or blockade or surge military operations. And I think Super Typhoon Senluca underlined that problem, if you remember. Back when the Associated Press reported when that typhoon hit Tinian and Saipan, flooding, down power lines, sheltering of more than 1,000 residents across Guam and the Northern Marianas. The Associated Press also reported sustained winds up to 150 miles an hour. It noted that Saipan is still recovering from 2018's Super Typhoon Yuta, as well as the COVID economic shock. So the bottom line here on this story, every typhoon is a rehearsal for contested logistics. In my mind, this is a great training opportunity. If the United States wants the CNMI to carry military weight, it has to harden civilian infrastructure too. They have a National Guard. Small issue. I get it. But their National Guard proposal is gaining momentum. They have one. They want to grow it. News Service reported in March of 26 that a formal working group is being established to outline this unit's structure, their mission, involving local leaders. But local leaders are arguing that it could create careers, improve island security, repurposing existing facilities, bring home a lot of residents currently serving in the Guam National Guard, Chamorro National Guard. They lack the local uniformed emergency response that it would need. Most U.S. jurisdictions have something like this, so a CNMI wants the same thing. They're not looking to win wars. It's not the point. It's local resilience, disaster response. So if Washington is serious, the Guard or equivalent defense force, it's one of the smaller investments available. Okay, looking big picture, strategically, what does this mean for the United States? It means that it's becoming part of the Pacific Deterrence Plan. We're trying to solve the Guam problem by distributing risk. Guam has some major strategic military installations and force. It's going to get hit, and it's going to get hit hard. So how do you fix that? You put some in Tinian, Saipan, Rota, Peleliu, Australia, Japan, the Philippines, and a bunch of other nodes. And that gives distributed. It gives Washington sovereign territorial access. It's much more reliable than many foreign basing agreements. But here's the hard truth. Bases don't equal resilience. If you build it, but you don't have the fuel, the power, the water, the local legitimacy, the repair capacity, as well as political trust, then it's just a target with a ribbon cutting ceremony. Now, what does this mean for China? They don't need to invade CNMI to exploit it. The softer path here, as we talked about, is influence. It's money, tourism leverage, it's criminal networks, it's political pressure, and I think it's information operations. The casino issue, the visa waiver debate, birth tourism, they all sit inside that gray zone envelope. I would expect Beijing or Beijing-link actors to frame U.S. militarization as colonial exploitation, while very quietly probably probing CNMI's economic weak points. Now, what is this going to mean for Guam? Well, CNMI is becoming Guam's northern extension, really, in a crisis. I think the two of them will function as a single operational cluster. It means that the islands are going to receive a lot more U.S. attention and more adversary attention. For the residents, It's going to mean more jobs, more contracts, more port work, a lot of construction, a lot of federal money, and look, man, possibly guard careers. There will also be a lot of noise, a lot of arguing over land use, environmental fights, cultural site concerns, fair point, housing pressure, also resentment. If the locals feel the benefits are captured by the contractors, well, the burdens stay on the island. So what is it going to mean for the Indo-Pacific at large? It is a small place with large strategic meaning. It is part of the shift from big bases and a safe rear area to small nodes inside contested range. The planet is shrinking every year. As our military technology expands, the planet contracts. They are no longer outside of the threat ring. And that's the future of the Pacific fight right there. Small nodes. A couple of key caveats on this story. Some reporting on the visa waiver risks are coming from political actors who have incentives to frame the issue very aggressively. And I want to make sure that that's clear. The casino reporting is very serious and very detailed, but allegations and investigations, not the same thing as convictions or proof. All the military plans that I discussed are still subject to environmental review, local politics, as well as funding. The biggest blind spot here is completely classified. I do not know exactly how the United States Indo-Pacific Command intends to use CNMI in a Taiwan, Philippines, or Guam contingency fight. Those op plans are all classified. I'll never see them. Neither will you. And none of us will know until it actually comes to fruition. Hopefully it doesn't. Let's look at Iran. We're going to look at Iran in two cases, and we're going to look at it from a little different lens. Not going to give you strike numbers. I'm not going to give you Strait of Hormuz. No, we're actually going to go inside the country of Iran. We're going to look at some of the ethnic groups that populate Iran that are adversarial to the regime. There has been discussions in the last couple of weeks about what about the Kurds and could we arm them and could the CIA give them weapons? And there was a story about that. Will they become armed, organized, and incentivized enough to provide a second front against the regime in this? Actually, I guess it would be a third one because it's Israel, the United States. A ground front then, let's phrase it like that. Well, it's much more than the Kurds, as a matter of fact. And it's much more than opposition groups organic to Iran. There are neighboring states. We're also going to look at the challenges of a ground invasion should the U.S. decide. Now, I don't think that they will. My subjective opinion is that's one of the dumbest things that you could do, but it's an interesting thought experiment. So I thought, and I experimented, and I'm going to share that with you. But first, let's talk about Iran's geography a little bit. Let's talk about their ethnic map. Let's talk about some of the makeup of the indigenous people that are adversarial to the regime. Let's look at their strengths and their weaknesses. Hopefully, by the end of this segment, you'll know more about Iran's ethnic groups than probably anyone else around the water cooler. And if you follow along with me and you're enjoying an adult beverage, then you're probably going to likely be as buzzed as you can be by the end of this, because it is somewhat of a deep dive. Okay. You ready? Your glass full? Okay, here we go. Delicious. Iran's geography and their ethnic map. They're not separate problems. They're the same battle space viewed from different layers. So the terrain of Iran gives the Islamic Republic a lot of defensive depth. The Iranian Republican Guard Corps gives it coercive depth. The ethnic borderlands give it vulnerability depth. Iran is a fortress state whose strongest defensive terrain also contains its most politically combustible seams. the Zagros, Alborz, deserts, Gulf Coast, and Strait of Hormuz make invasion brutally difficult. The IRGC's 32 territorial commands, the Purge, their networks, the missile forces, the Quds forces, the IRGC Navy, all of them turn that terrain into a regime survival machine. But let's look at the periphery. Kurdistan, Sistan Balochistan. Oh my God, I ruined that name. Sorry, one more time. Balochistan. Thank you. Khuzestan, the Azeri Northwest, and the tribal Zagros Belt. All of that is where repression and identity and poverty and border access and state violence create a lot of reoccurring instability for the regime. They have before we invaded, and they have, I mean, really since the Shah left, probably before that as well, because a lot of these people would like independent territories. This added ethnic group assessment clearly identifies the Kurds as the most organized opposition minority, but Balak as the most tactically active insurgent threat. The Awazi Arabs as the most economically dangerous pressure point, and the Azeris as the largest but most integrated latent variable. Iran is a bad invasion country. It's not difficult bad. The terrain just punishes speed. The mountains canalize armor. The deserts murder tempo. And the cities consume manpower. Fighting in an urban environment, it sucks. It is the worst. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz, it globalizes the economic cost. So all of that combines. The IRGC's territorial architecture, it turns each province into a security box, and Iran's ethnic borderlands create both opportunity and danger. They are pressure points against Tehran, but they are not simple tools for any outside power. And this is, I think, where a lot of the media reporting seems to get it wrong, because they look at Iran and they see minorities, they see mountains, oil fields, and unrest. And then they imagine this neat fragmentation strategy. It's not a board game map. These ethnic groups are not chess pieces. So if you hate the regime, you're probably going to hate foreign occupation even more. And the regime knows this and it uses it. Their best survival narrative is not love of clerics. It is fear of Syria-style collapse, the fear of separatism, civil war, a lot of national dismemberment. So in my mind, the real assessment is this: Iran's periphery can bleed the regime. It probably cannot replace the regime by itself. Iran's defensive system has, I think, 3 layers. The first is physical geography. The Zagros Mountains in the west. And please, I encourage you to just pull out the spinny thing that you keep in the office. It's called a globe. And sort of zoom in and take a look at some of this, and you'll get a better understanding of what I'm talking about. The Zagros Mountains in the west and the southwest. The Alborz Mountains north of Tehran. Central deserts and plateaus, the Gulf coastline, the Strait of Hormuz, the urban basins, and protected interior corridor. This geography slows invasion. It compresses routes, and it gives a lot of the defenders time. So that's layer number 1. Layer number 2 is regime security architecture. You've got the Iranian Republican Guard Corps ground forces divided into 32 territorial or provincial commands. The Bajij Mobilization Network, the IRGC Intelligence Organization, Aerospace Force Missiles and Drones. You have their Navy Sea Denial capability, the Quds Force External Proxy Network. Don't discount it. And then you have an economic arm, such as the Qatam al-Aniyab linked structures. All of that architecture turns that aforementioned terrain into command. Third layer, and we're going to talk a lot about this one, ethnic and sectarian fault lines. You have a bunch of groups in the country of Iran. You have the Kurds in the west and the northwest, the Baluch in the southeast, the Awazi Arabs in Khuzestan, Azeers in the northwest, the Lurs and Bakhtari in the Zagros belt, the Turkmen in the northeast, the Kashki in the Fars and south central Iran, the Caspian peoples, they live in the north, and all of them, this layer gives Iran both vulnerability, but it also gives them resilience, because the periphery is where Tehran often tends to overpress. But the same fear of fragmentation also lets Tehran rally a lot of these reluctant nationalists. They're not all anti-regime here. And that's the paradox, because Iran's ethnic geography is a weakness for regime stability, but it doesn't automatically mean a strength for foreign intervention. You see what I'm saying? The most adversarial towards the regime are definitely the Kurds, no doubt about it. The most dangerous, though, tactically is the bloc militants. The most dangerous strategically are the Awazi Arabs. And the most overrated as an immediate rebellion risk are the Azeris. That ranking matters because it separates size from threat. The Azeris are large, but the Kurds are more organized. The Baluch militants are more tactically active. The Awazi Arabs sit closer to the economic jugular. Let's look at them a little more as we move on. Kurds, most organized opposition minority. The Kurds are Tehran's, I would say, most mature, best word I can think of, ethnic opposition problem. They combine a couple of different things: political parties, armed factions, diaspora media, so they have that going for them. Don't discount propaganda, folks. It can win battles. Cross-border depth, because they have the ability to go into Iraq, Iraqi Kurdistan, back and forth. They live in mountainous terrain, sucks to fight in the mountains, historically resistant mythology. They are very old, culturally speaking, and they have a reputation. They have a lot of symbolic power after Amini. They also have experience with repression, experience with abandonment. We abandoned them as well. Way to go, us. Kurdish groups and their current include PAK, PJAK, KTP, KTPI, yeah, that's right. And PDKI-linked networks, Kamali-linked currents, and other Iraqi-based Iranian Kurdish organizations. In fact, the Associated Press reported in January of this year that the Kurdistan Freedom Party, or PAK, claimed armed operations against IRGC targets in a couple different cities, Lam, Kermanshah, Firkuzu, after the protest crackdowns earlier in this year. But to be fair, Associated Press, they couldn't independently verify the claimed battlefield effects. Well, this is why Tehran sees Kurdish activism as a double threat, because domestic rebellion plus a lot of foreign penetration. Some of that is admittedly propaganda. Some of it reflects real cross-border organization. I don't know the level of organization that's taking place between the Kurds in Iraq and the Kurds in Iran. But it doesn't really matter because both can be true. The Kurds matter because they sit where terrain and politics are meeting. You get Western Iran, very mountainous. It is adjacent to Iraqi Kurdistan. It's historically difficult to Tehran to fully pacify. It makes Kurdish opposition hard to erase, even when it is suppressed. My assessment is that the Kurds are the most serious political military opposition minority. But they've been very, very cautious. And I think for good reason, because they remember being used. They remember having a lot of promises made, and then they were abandoned, and they were punished. I think it's going to be a tough sell. They're unlikely to launch any kind of decisive campaign unless Tehran visibly fractures or outside guarantees look credible. And that last one is going to be the hard one. Now, the next group, you look at the Baluch. I've heard it both ways. They are the most tactically dangerous insurgent front, the regime's most immediate hard security problem. Sistan, Baluchistan, it's very poor. It's Sunni by makeup, religious. It's tribal, very underdeveloped, and it is borderland. But it is already militarized. It touches Pakistan and Afghanistan. It has smuggling routes, weak economic integration, deep resentment, as well as recurring clashes involving militants, police, and IRGC-linked forces. They're very experienced. Jaish al-Adl remains the key insurgent brand. Associated Press reports in August of last year that Iranian security forces killed 13 militants in Sistan, Baluchistan, after attacks attributed by Iranian media to al-Adl, which describes itself as seeking, they want greater rights for the Baluch minority. Reuters also reported in April of this year that Iran executed a man convicted of membership in Jaish and involvement in attacks against Iranian security forces. So it's not just protest politics. This is ambushes. It is police attacks. It is insurgent networks. Border movements, yes, but sectarian grievance. It's the kind of place, talking about Sistan, it's the kind of place where the state loses control first, right there at the peripheral. These poor, armed, resentful, very difficult to govern without coercion people. My assessment, if the question is who is most likely to shoot at the regime tomorrow, the answer are probably these guys. They're militants. If the question is who can build a broader national political alternative, then I think the answer is more likely the Kurds. Let's move on to the Awazi Arabs. They, as I said earlier, are the most dangerous on the economic pressure point. Now, the Awazi Arabs are not currently the loudest insurgent front, but they sit squarely on, I would say, the regime's jugular, right? Kyrgyzstan is oil, it's gas, it's ports, it's petrochemicals, it's water, and it's the Iraq frontier, and they're sitting right on it. That makes the Awazi Arab unrest strategically different from other ethnic pressure points, because a serious uprising in this area doesn't merely embarrass Tehran, it could quite literally threaten their state revenue. It could threaten their energy infrastructure, their export capability, wartime logistics, all of it. And that's why this region in Iraq is so sensitive. It is ethnic geography, but it's also resource geography. All right. It is invasion route geography. I would also say it's deeply symbolic because of the Iran-Iraq war. Tehran remembers the vulnerability of Kyrgyzstan. It will not treat unrest there as local protest. It will treat it as existential. So my assessment for these folks is Awazi unrest is the sleeper risk. It's not the highest current tempo, potentially the most economically damaging though. Let's take a look at the Azeris. They are the largest latent variable, not the current spearhead. They are often overhyped by analysts who oftentimes confuse demographics with rebellion. And I think that's a bad read. They are one of Iran's largest minority populations. They're Turkic speaking, so they speak Turkish, concentrated heavily in the Northwest, and culturally distinct. But they're also deeply integrated into the Islamic Republic clerical, military, commercial, and nationalistic structures. I think a major Azeri break with Tehran it'd be earthquake level. It'd be huge. But the thing of it is that there is not enough evidence to treat that as imminent. And that's where I think we have to be critical thinkers when we talk about this argument. Size does not equal insurgency. Identity does not equal rebellion. Cultural distinction does not automatically become separatism. My assessment here is that the Azeris are not the current center of gravity for any anti-regime ethnic resistance. They become decisive in a secession crisis, in state fracture scenario, maybe a post-regime vacuum, but they're not necessarily before. Let's look at Lurs, Bakhtiari, Kashkai, Turkmen, and the Caspian peoples. These groups matter, but they're not the main organized threat drivers right now. The Lurs and the Bakhtiari matter because they sit in the Zagros belt. That is an area where terrain and tribal identity and poverty and a lot of Western protest geography all intersect. Now, they can amplify unrest in Western and Southwestern Iran, but they don't currently possess the same opposition infrastructure as, the Kurds, for example, or the same kinetic insurgent as the Balak militants. The Kashkai have historical tribal autonomy, a lot of autonomy in South Central Iran, but they are also not currently a central armed anti-regime front. The Turkmen in the Northeast have Sunni and cross-border cultural dimensions. But they don't currently appear to be a primary driver of any anti-regime pressure. There's a couple of other ones. The Galaks, Mazandarians, and the Caspian peoples, all culturally distinct, but they're not major organized ethnic security fronts against Tehran. My assessment of all of them, quite frankly, is these groups are strategically relevant in any kind of a collapse or transition scenario. But as I mentioned, they're not the main pressure engines today. So this is where previous, military structure assessments become essential. The Iranian Republican Guard Corps Ground Forces command system it's not just a defense arrangement against any kind of foreign invasion, right? It's a lot of it is domestic control mapped onto Iran's ethnic and geographic fault lines. It means that the regime cannot merely have a national military response. It has these localized security boxes. The Kurdish West, all monitored through provincial IRGC intelligence and border security structure, and their police. The bloc southeast is treated as counterinsurgency, border control, and anti-military territory. Khuzestan is treated as energy security terrain and Arab unrest terrain. The Azeri Northwest, it's watched as a nationalist, ethnic, and border adjacent space. Tehran treated as the regime's existential nerve center. And I think that this is the point. These 32 territorial commands are how Tehran turns geography into repression, because they allow the regime to localize force, isolate unrest, control movement. They integrate the Baji manpower, they coordinate with intelligence, and they suppress a lot of these protests before they become a national command crisis. They're very aware that these ethnic groups exist, that they have competing interests towards the regime, and that allowed to protest and organize could potentially be a pretty existential threat. That is why these street protests alone struggle to break the Islamic Republic, because the regime does not need one perfect national response. It has many of them. It has many provincial responses. The regime's ethnic playbook is blunt and consistent. And we've seen this time and time again. We saw it in the protests, starting last year, spilling into this year, and protests in the past, conflate the protests with terrorism. When minority regions rise, Tehran always frames dissent as some kind of separatism, outside threat, terrorism, foreign manipulations. Oh, yeah. And of course, it's Zionist and American plotting. And sometimes armed groups are genuinely active, but the regime deliberately expands that label to criminalize a lot of the broader dissent. Kurdish areas, Sistan and Khuzestan are treated as security environments first and civic communities second. So you can expect things like checkpoints, a lot of arrests, a lot of Republican Guard Corps deployments to the area, surveillance, internet controls, a lot of knock and sweeps, and intimidation, just flat out. They understand where the risks are, and they suppress them ruthlessly in many cases. They use a lot of executions as political signaling. In fact, recent reporting has highlighted Iran's execution surge and the disproportionate fear created amongst political prisoners and protesters and minority communities. The Guardian reported in May of this year that rights groups described near daily secret executions, including victims from Kurdish minority backgrounds, amid all of this broader protest repression. I would expect Persian nationalist fear to be Tehran's most effective argument. The regime tells the Persian and integrated, urban middle class, if you will, after us comes Syria, Libya, Iraq, separatism, foreign occupation, total national collapse. And that argument works better than any clerical ideology for many reluctant regime tolerators, those people in the middle. That propaganda works to suppress them. This regime survives not only by making people believe in it, but honestly, by fearing the alternative. And this is generationally done. This is not 2025, 26, 24. I'm talking for decades. The ethnic layer changes in any invasion assessment. It doesn't make invasion easier in any clean way, on one way or another. Now, it does make the battle space more complex. The Kurds could strain the Western security grid. Kurdish opposition activity could complicate Iranian Republican Guard control in the west, northwest, especially near the Zagros and Iraqi Kurdistan. But Kurdish groups would most likely be very cautious about becoming visible instruments of a foreign invasion. They don't want that label, especially with the West's past in negotiating with them. The risk of post-war abandonment burned into their memory. Absolutely. The Baluch militants could tie down security forces in the southeast. Their insurgent activity would force Tehran to divert Republican Guard Corps, police, and intelligence resources. But Sistan, Baluchistan, it's very remote. It's poor and it's far from Iran's decisive political core. Yeah, it's a pressure point, but it's not a clean route to Tehran. Awazi Arab unrest, yeah, it could threaten oil infrastructure. It definitely would. And this is the most economically dangerous scenario. But Khuzestan disruption would hit Iran's oil, gas, ports, a lot of their money coming in. Unfortunately, it would also trigger severe repression because Tehran sees this area as existential terrain. Azeri movements would be decisive only in an event that the center of the regime cracks. And Azeri break from Tehran would be, I mean, in many ways, it would be transformative, but banking on it now, total fantasy. They're too integrated to assume automatic revolt. External support could backfire. Any of our fingerprints can strengthen Tehran's narrative. We've talked about this before, this rallying around the flag. The nation is under attack. Minorities are being weaponized to break Iran apart. That narrative would be used, and that narrative can cause even anti-regime Iranians to recoil and rally. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Foreign support, a lot of times, can empower minorities. And we're trying it in limited ways, tactically, though, but it also damages them politically. Iran's periphery, these minority groups, they're both a fuse and a firewall. They're a fuse because it can ignite faster than the center, but it's a firewall because the regime uses fear of peripheral fragmentation to discipline the center. And that's their shtick, man. It's this triangle, if you will. You first repress the margins, you scare the center, claim only the regime can prevent national collapse. And that's why ethnic unrest is dangerous, but it's not automatically regime ending. Any, Kurdish, Awazi, Baluch surge would stress the Republican Guard Corps across a lot of distant terrain, but any minorities alone probably can't topple the regime. A real national collapse is still going to require Persian urban participation, labor strikes. Ooh, we were there, weren't we? Oil sector disruptions. We were there. Police and Bizarre paralysis, elite defections, security force fragmentations, clerical splits, communication resilience. Starlink would be a good one there. Well done, Elon. Well done to the unknown individuals that smuggled 10,000 Starlinks into Iran during this protest. Good job, you. Credible post-regime political architecture. It's weak. There's very little. Without those, any minority unrest bleeds the regime, but it's not going to break it. So just remember, as we close this segment out, Iran is not defended by mountains alone. It's defended by mountains, deserts, but also missiles, mines, militias, proxy networks, territorial commands, intelligence organs, economic patronage, a shitload of repression, and a lot of propaganda on fear of fragmentation. But I will say this, the same system has a weakness. Its strongest security grip is needed most in places where legitimacy is weakest. The Kurds are the most organized adversarial minority. The Baluch militants are the most tactically dangerous. The Awazi Arabs are the most strategically dangerous because of oil and infrastructure in that region. Azeris are the largest latent variable, but not the current rebellion spearhead. The other groups, the Lurs, the Bakhtari, Kushki, Turkmen, and the Caspian, they matter more in a transition or collapse scenario than in the current kinetic threat picture. The final strategic synthesis, I'd say it's this. Geography makes invasion expensive. Republican Guard Corps structure makes regime collapse difficult. Its ethnic geography makes any long-term stability very fragile. That is the contradiction inside the Islamic Republic. It is hard to conquer from the outside. It is hard to reform from the inside. It is hard to hold together without coercion. The road remains. The road remains. The rifle rules, and the mountains protect the state. The margins that we talked about remember the wounds. Some of the key caveats I want you to understand about this segment is that a lot of these ethnic groups are not monoliths. You know, the Kurds, the Arabs, the Azeris. It doesn't mean that every person in these communities supports separatism, armed struggle, or foreign invasion. A lot of them don't. The regime deliberately labels dissent as separatism or terrorism to justify their repressions. Opposition sources a lot of times inflate activity. Iranian state sources often fabricate these foreign control narratives. External support to minority groups can backfire by strengthening Tehran's survival narrative. Ethnic rest or unrest, both, can destabilize the regime, but a successful national transition, it still requires broad Persian urban participation. It requires fractures of the elite, massive labor disruptions, and security force splits. It cannot be done without all of them in concert. It's not impossible to do. We're not there. We're not there. There has been discussions about a ground invasion in Iraq. There has been let me try that one again. There have been individuals who have reached out to me to ask, do you think we are going to invade Iran? One of my family members, for example, wasn't if, it was like, well, when we invade Iran, like, slow down there, you. I don't think that it is going to happen. I think that it is extraordinarily costly. But I was curious. I told you it was going to be a thought experiment, so let's experiment, shall we? What would a possible U.S. ground invasion look like? Okay. As I have mentioned, changing Iran from within is difficult. Changing from the outside is even worse. It would probably begin as a limited war, not a declared invasion. I think that Washington would almost certainly avoid starting with, we are invading Iran. It would likely begin under a much narrower legal and political frame. I think it would start with protecting shipping, securing the Strait of Hormuz. It would have to destroy missile and drone threats, across the board. Meanwhile, you have to defend U.S. forces and allies in the region. There would most likely be a blockade or at least a maritime exclusion zone that prevents further attack on commercial vessels. You also have to degrade the Republican Guard Forces command and control. Now that matters because the current fight already revolves around the Strait of Hormuz, the shipping, blockade pressure, ceasefire ambiguity, all of it, right? In fact, Reuters reports in May 9th of this year that U.S.-Iran efforts to end the war had stalled while Gulf clashes have continued. I'm sure you saw this, including U.S. strikes on Iran-linked vessels, which were attempting to enter Iranian ports. So the first phase would probably not be sold as regime change. It would be sold as, again, force protection, maritime stabilization. But wars grow teeth. A limited campaign could expand if Iran continued its missile attacks or maritime disruptions or proxy actions and any strikes on the Gulf base. I think the first real campaign would probably be an air campaign with a boatload, if you'll excuse the turn of phrase, of maritime dominance. Before any major U.S. ground force entered Iran, Washington would need to reduce Iran's ability to punish staging areas, wherever we put troops ashore, our convoys, our ships, as well as regional basing. And that means that the opening campaign would most likely focus on more air defense suppression, a lot of those missile and drone launch networks, IRGC's aerospace force infrastructure. There's coastal defense systems that would have to be taken out, naval swarm capabilities, command and control nodes, intelligence and surveillance systems would have to go. Ports and maritime enforcement sites, all of these are, in the targeting playbook. I have no doubt between Israel and the United States, these are already on the target list. Mine warfare and any Strait of Hormuz security. None of those are optional. They would have to be taken out. Their defense concept, I'm talking about Iran's, it relies on missiles, drones, maritime denial, and proxy operations, rather than any kind of conventional symmetry. So the Defense Intelligence Analysis Agency, Public Iran Military Assessment, has described Iran's military strategy around deterrence, ballistic missiles, naval forces able to threaten the Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, and unconventional proxy capabilities. So, they're terrorist arms, Hezbollah, all that stuff. The Strait of Hormuz is central to this. CRS reports republished by USNI. It states that roughly 27% of the global maritime crude oil and petroleum product trade and about 20% of the global liquefied natural gas pass through the strait. So U.S. is going to face two simultaneous necessities here. You have to protect the invasion force. Number two is you have to keep the global economy from panicking. And right off the bat, this is already a contradiction. The more force Washington applies, the more Iran can threaten the Strait of Hormuz. The more Iran threatens the Hormuz, the more Washington is pulled in deeper. I think that any ground entry is probably going to be very limited at first. I think any sane U.S. military planner would avoid immediately trying to drive on Tehran. That would be much too ambitious, extraordinarily exposed politically. It's also logistically dangerous. I think a much more plausible ground entry model would most likely begin with very limited objectives like securing staging corridors, protecting ports and airports, creating buffer zones, seize limited coastal and border terrain. You're going to have to use your ground forces to support maritime operations. Specific military infrastructures would be targeted. I would expect your Rangers and your 82nd Airborne to be instrumental there. And then you're going to have to prevent IRGC attacks from a lot of those selected areas. Probably support evacuation and hostage recovery contingencies. A lot of leverage for negotiations as well. So in other words, the first U.S. ground presence would likely be expeditionary and coercive. You have 2 Marine expeditionary units there. Probably they would be the tip of the spear, and then you flow forces in behind them. Not occupation heavy, though. Here's the problem. Once the United States troops are physically inside Iran, Tehran has every incentive to turn the campaign into a nationalist war of resistance. This is where the invasion stops being a military operation and becomes this huge political furnace. Western access is the most plausible and the most dangerous. The most plausible large force ground approach would be from the West, through Iraq, toward Western Iran. Why? Well, because the U.S. has experience. It has infrastructure memory, and it has a lot of regional military familiarity in Iraq. Western Iran also contains important routes toward Khuzestan, Kermanshah, Elam, Kurdistan, and eventually the Iranian interior. But this access runs into the Zagros Mountains, and that's the trap. The Zagros will channel the United States movement into roads and passes, valleys and tunnels, bridges, and very predictable corridors. Heavy forces need width. The mountains deny width. Once the forces become road-bound, logistics become the main vulnerability. We would probably win most direct fights, but that's not the issue. No, the issue is this. It's the tail. It's our fuel convoys, ammo convoys, medevac routes, route clearance teams, engineer units, bridge repair, maintenance columns, recovery vehicles, forward supply depots, air defense umbrellas. Oh, I'm not done. Rear area security. All of this sound familiar? Yeah, read A Bear Went Over the Mountain. The Afghanistan Mujahideens fight against the Soviets way back in the day. They learned these lessons very, very painfully, and we would learn them too because of the canalizing terrain. Iran wouldn't need to defeat any spearhead. They'd probably let them through. The attack, it would attack the logistics, the bloodstream. The center of gravity would be the U.S. supply lines, not the first U.S. tank. A southern coastal lodgment is possible, but really ugly. The United States might also consider a limited southern or Gulf-oriented ground campaign tied to the Strait of Hormuz, Bandar Abbas, Bushehr, Khuzestan, or other coastal infrastructure. But amphibious or coastal operations against Iran, very high risk. Their coastlines, mines, coastal missiles, drones, you have fast attack boats, submarines, artillery. The Navy harassment would make any amphibious landing or port seizure operation extremely dangerous. The Financial Times reported, I want to say today, in describing the Iranian Republican Guard Force Navy, their Mosquito fleet of fast attack boats as central to Iran's ability to disrupt the strait. Despite U.S. naval superiority, it's a very asymmetric warfare threat that is challenging to mitigate. So a southern operation would likely aim at a lot of this maritime leverage rather than, again, any regime collapse. Possible strategic purpose in that would be to reduce Iran's ability to threaten the strait, secure a lot of the coastal infrastructure, secure shipping lanes, create a negotiating lever. But it would also force Iran to defend the coast. It would dilute its internal security forces in doing so. But the risk is enormous here because once ashore, the United States would need to sustain the force under missile, drone, mine, and swarm pressure. Hey, man, getting in is very, very hard. Staying supplied is harder. And getting out cleanly would probably be the hardest of all. A direct drive to Tehran would be the absolute nightmare scenario, without a doubt. A full regime change invasion would require moving beyond limited coastal or border objectives and pushing toward Tehran and other regime centers. And that would mean you have to cross a boatload of mountain terrain. You have to secure major cities. You have to eliminate the Republican Guard Corps provincial commands. You're going to have to suppress the Baj networks. I'm not saying that right either. Protect all of those supply lines we talked about. Sabotage, ethnic fault lines. You would have to control prisons, ministries, media, communication, fuel, ports, airports, and borders. You'd also have to prevent proxy escalation across the entire region. And this is where this ground invasion of Iran fantasy completely collapsed. This is not Baghdad in 2003. Iran is larger. It's more mountainous. It's more populous. It's more ideologically hardened. And it's also more deeply prepared for a lot of asymmetric defenses. Its Iranian Republican Guard Corps territorial command systems, they exist precisely to keep regime security functions alive, one province at a time. So the United States might reach Tehran with enough force, but reaching is not controlling, and controlling is not legitimizing. And that last word right there is the killer. The Republican Guard Corps is not going to fight one clean conventional battle. They would likely avoid giving the U.S. the kind of conventional battle that America prefers. Instead, it would try to fracture the campaign. I would expect Iran to turn the war into a lot of overlapping pressure zones. So Iran would not need to stop every single U.S. advance. It just needs to make every advance expensive, every pause dangerous, make every one of our allies very nervous, and every single news cycle politically poisonous, similar to what Ukraine is doing to the Russians, just with less moxie. The most plausible U.S. invasion model truly is probably going to unfold as a widening ladder and not a single, dramatic invasion. Let's break it down by some phases, right? As we've said, you have a coercive air and maritime campaign. That would be to degrade Iran's missile, drone, navy, and air defense threat, all while protecting Gulf shipping and our U.S. forces. Now, this is already the logic of the current confrontation around the Strait of Hormuz. Phase 2, blockade and exclusion enforcement. The purpose of that would be to prevent Iranian military resupply, limits their oil movement, it pressures Tehran economically, and it forces diplomatic concession. The risk there, though, as Iran will retaliate against tankers, any Gulf infrastructure, any U.S. bases in the area, any allied states that even offer us, a refueling stop. Phase 3, limited ground lodgements. The purpose there would be to secure very specific coastal or border areas, identified strategic ports and airfields, or any infrastructure nodes tied to maritime security and force protection. And I would imagine it's going to be framed as very limited on our end. But on their end, on the Iranian end, they're going to frame it as an invasion. Just bear that in mind. And it is. Phase 4 would be expansion while under fire. And the purpose there is to widen the control zones if Iran escalates. And make no mistake, they're going to escalate. This is where the campaign becomes extremely dangerous in my mind. The U.S. starts needing more troops, not to win, but just to protect what it already took. Phase 5 is, let's call it regime pressure campaign. The purpose there would be to degrade the Iranian Guard Corps command. You have to try and split the elites at the top if they see that the walls are closing in like rats leaving a sinking ship. Encourage a lot of that internal pressure that causes that to happen. And then you force negotiations or you force collapse, one of the two. The risk there, though, is the regime hardens. Nationalist sentiment is going to rise, and the Guard Corps is going to gain emergency legitimacy. Phase 6, well, let's call that a negotiated exit. It's either that or an occupation trap. That's the fork in the road at the end of this map. Either the United States gets a negotiated settlement before it owns too much terrain, or it slides towards the occupation problem. You're now responsible for cities, roads, ministries, borders, police, food, electricity, prisons, and legitimacy. We tried that once, if anyone was remembering. That right there is where military victory becomes absolute strategic quicksand. So what would make a full invasion make sense? I mean, honestly, almost nothing short of an extreme scenario, and I mean extreme, a full United States ground invasion would only become thinkable if several conditions are all stacked together. The first is Iran directly killed large numbers of U.S. personnel. Sink a carrier. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed or severely disrupted with either mines or fast attack boats. Iran attacking a Gulf ally at scale. Nuclear breakout fears become immediate, like they're getting ready to construct and or launch. Complete diplomatic collapse. Somehow Congress and the American public opinion would have to move towards war. I don't see it happening. And you would also have to have the Gulf states in the region all accept major basing risk. Don't forget Israel. They would have to also demand expanded action because they would have to be a partner in this. You'd also need United States leadership believing that the regime collapse was close, was already near, right? Even then, thinkable doesn't mean wise. Any invasion right now or at any point would be a massive strategic gamble. And the opportunity cost, brutal. Indo-Pacific deterrence, force readiness. Don't forget oil prices, domestic stability, NATO bandwidth, counterterrorism, debt, recruitment, domestically, and political legitimacy. What would probably go wrong would be, I think the most likely failures are very predictable. We've seen them already. Mission creep. We started as a maritime protection and becomes regime war. Logistics. We win battles, but we struggle to secure long-term supply lines through mountains, deserts, and hostile urban areas. Brittle. Hormuz escalation. Iran could impose enough maritime risk to spike prices, which would fracture any coalition patience. You could also have a broadening of a lot of the proxies in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and the Gulf states all become pressure theaters. You'd get a lot of ethnic blowback. Minority unrest rises, but Tehran would use it to sell the war as a foreign partition plot. You'd have a lot of urban resistance in all of the major cities, Tehran, Shiraz, Mashhad, Avaz, political security problems, not just military objectives. No legitimate replacement authority. And that's the big one. Okay, so you destroy regime capability. It's a lot easier than creating post-regime legitimacy. If there's no credible Iranian-led transition structure, there's not, then guess who inherits the collapse? We do. That is Iraq's ghost, only larger and much harder. What would we prefer instead? I will tell you the smarter strategy would be avoiding a full ground invasion unless absolutely forced. I think the most likely options are air and missile strikes, as we've seen, a lot of cyber disruption, a little bit of that, maritime interdiction, we've got that, blockade pressure, covert action, sanctions escalation, and support for communications and civil society. Limited special operations, defensive deployments to the Gulf states, which we've been doing, Israeli-enabled intelligence pressure, it's there. Proxy network disruption, quite possibly, we've seen some of that already as well, and negotiated coercion. That does not mean these are clean or risk-free. It means they avoid the one thing Iran's terrain and the Iranian Republican Guard Corps structure are designed to punish the hardest: large-scale foreign occupation. All right, bottom line here. A possible U.S. ground invasion of Iran would probably begin as a limited campaign around Hormuz and then expand into selective lodgements on the ground if Iran kept escalating. A full invasion would require pushing through some really bad terrain, and you would fight for every city block of that terrain. Meanwhile, you're undergoing missile attacks, maritime disruptions, proxy escalations, and ethnic fault lines. The U.S. could smash Iranian military assets. It could seize pieces of terrain. It could probably defeat Iranian forces in direct engagement. But the strategic question, it's not whether America can break the door. The question is what happens when it walks into the house. Iran? Built to make that house burn, motherfucker. Okay, a couple of caveats here. This is my strategic assessment. It's not a tactical invasion plan. I'm not drawing on any op plans that I wasn't supposed to see. I'm just assessing the MET-T SL. There's a lot. The mission, the enemy, the times, troops, terrains, equipment, all of it. And I'm giving you a tactical invasion. A limited ground invasion from the United States is more plausible than a full Tehran-focused occupation. I just wanted to do this little thought experiment to sort of make an argument against it, but what it would look like. Tehran does not make Iran invincible. Sorry, the terrain does not make Iran invincible. It just makes control very, very expensive. A lot of ethnic unrest could pressure Tehran, but I'll tell you what, U.S. exploitation or over U.S. exploitation, it could backfire very, very badly. The most likely U.S. objective would be coercion and degradation, not immediate occupation, unless the war escalated beyond political control. Okay. It's an interesting thought experiment. And I mean, I absolutely enjoy it. I like looking at this sort of thing. Last week, we talked a little bit about the hunter-killer satellites, the Russian co-orbital ASAT. Let's talk about it a little bit. Get into the details just a little bit more so we have a broader understanding of what's taking place above our heads. There were some comments on some of the social media feeds that, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but I was basically talking out of my ass that the scenario that I was playing out was unrealistic. Russia doesn't have this capability. There is nothing to fear. The sky is not filling. First off, let me say one thing. Obviously, the sky is not falling. I mean, it's in low Earth orbit and geosynchronous. They're staying up there. That's a joke. It's stupid, but it's still a joke. But I'm basing everything that I'm reporting to you off of established facts or the facts that are at least corroborated double source reporting. So it is happening. What the second and third order effects of it are going to be are still playing out in real time. But I owe it to you to lay out the facts, and then you make your own assessment. I will say that Russia, they're not just testing odd satellites in space. It appears by all reporting to be moving toward an operational co-orbital counter space posture, and where satellites are placed into useful orbital geometry before a crisis so that they can stalk or inspect, threaten, jam, dazzle, disable, or physically attack U.S. and allied spacecraft with far less warning than a ground-launched ASAT missile, anti-satellite. But Russia is trying to make the United States space nervous system, I guess, targetable. That nervous system are things like GPS, ISR, missile warning communications, battlefield data links, commercial constellations, and then a space-enabled command and control. The technical behavior in orbit, things that are taking place right now, is becoming much more sophisticated. It's much more repeatable, and it's very useful much more tactically useful than it's ever been. The latest public indicators point to a shift from counter space experimentation to counter space positioning. And I'm drawing this from a couple of different sources. The United States Space Command's 2026 posture is one of them. It states that threats to the United States and partner space systems are no longer hypothetical. They are current operational realities. They are spanning terrestrial, on-orbit, cyber, along with Russia's pursuit of an on-orbit nuclear ASAT, listed among the most serious space domain threats. We'll talk about that towards the end. The U.S. intelligence community's 2026 annual threat assessment. Open source is another area that I am drawing my information from. They also say that Russia is building extensive counter space capabilities and developing a satellite meant to carry a nuclear weapon as an ASAT capability. But the immediate danger is not only the nuclear ASAT threat. The more usable, the more deniable, the more crisis relevant weapon is this co-orbital ASAT that we've been talking about last week and we're going to talk about right now. This is a spacecraft that shares orbital space with the target, in this case, U.S. satellites, and it can maneuver close enough to threaten it. Direct ascent ASATs are the rifle shot everyone sees coming, right, from the ground. Co-orbital ASATs are the knife already in the room. The most important new open source development since we talked about this last week is the observed behavior of 3 Russian Cosmos satellites, 2581, 2582, and 2583, in case anyone gives a shit. These were all launched back in February of last year. In late April of 26, this year, 2581 and 2583 reportedly came within roughly 10 feet or 3 meters of each other in low Earth orbit. Comstock assessed that Cosmos 2583 conducted deliberate, fine maneuvers to maintain the tight configuration, not a random pass. Now, third satellite, Cosmos 2582, trailed these two within a sub 100-kilometer range, while an additional deployed object, no idea what it was, Object F, I mean, I don't, someone does, right? Released by Cosmos 2583, also operated nearby. That's that nesting doll satellites that we've spoken about last week, where one hides inside of another one. This matters because close proximity operations at meter level separation, and that's what we're talking about here, it requires serious capability. You've got to have very precise orbital tracking, reliable propulsion. You have to have relative navigation, to the two objects. Autonomous or at least semi-autonomous guidance, because it has to be done in real time. You can't have delays. It can't always be done from Earth. Collision avoidance control, super command discipline, and a spacecraft bus capable of repeated maneuvers. That's not amateur hour. That is a spacecraft practicing the same core skills needed to approach another nation's satellite. What a co-orbital ASAT actually is a satellite that can maneuver into the orbital neighborhood of another satellite and then create effects against it. That can look like a whole bunch of things. And it doesn't need to look like a weapon. That's the whole point. The ASAT, co-orbital ASAT, could look like an inspector satellite or a servicing spacecraft, some kind of space situational awareness platform, or a maneuverable payload. It could also look like a nesting doll satellite that we're seeing, where it releases a smaller sub-satellite. It could also look like some kind of benign technology demonstrator, or even a dual-use spacecraft with legitimate and hostile applications. Secure World Foundation assesses that Russia has tested rendezvous and proximity operations in both low Earth orbit and geosynchronous all the way back since 2010. And that these operations could support co-orbital ASAT capability. It also notes possible links to the Russian Purge co-orbital ASAT program and Nivelir, a suspected surveillance tracking and support program. The same technology that is needed to inspect or service a satellite that's already up there is also the technology needed to stalk or attack one. The way that these work is you have orbital matching. That's first and foremost. The first requirement is you got to get the satellites into the right orbital geometry. A co-orbital, ASAT, does not simply fly up to a target like an aircraft. Satellites, man, they're moving at roughly 7.5 kilometers per second in low Earth orbit. And so to reach a target, the interceptor has to match that speed or manipulate a boatload of several orbital parameters. You've got to adjust altitude, inclination, right ascension of ascending node, eccentricity, argument of perigee, phase angle, relative velocity. I'm not a rocket scientist, and these are difficult for me to draw on a piece of paper. I can't imagine the technical knowledge needed to affect that in real time, but they're doing it. And the key term here is coplanar orbit. If the Russian satellite is placed into the same orbital plane as a U.S. satellite, it can repeatedly pass through the same orbital neighborhood. So that's why Cosmos 2576 was so concerning back in 2024. U.S. officials assessed it was likely a counter space weapon and that it had been placed into the same orbit as a U.S. government satellite. Secure World Foundation distinguishes Cosmos 2576 from the separate nuke ASAT concern, but notes that the United States claimed that it was deployed into the same orbit as a U.S. government satellite. Reuters likewise reported U.S. assessments that Cosmos 2576 was capable of inspecting and potentially attacking satellites and was placed in the same orbit as a satellite from America called USA 314. No idea what it does. That's the chess move here. You get into the same lane before the crisis. So now the co-orbital ASAT's up there and it doesn't do anything. It just waits. Rendezvous and proximity operations are important for phase 2, for second thing. Because once the satellite is in the right co-orbital plane, it must conduct RPO, which is rendezvous and proximity operations. RPO is the art of approaching another object in space without crashing into it. That requires relative navigation sensors, orbital determination software, propulsion control, attitude control, autonomous safety logic, command and control links, fuel management, and a high confidence tracking of the target's position and velocity. So there's got to be ground stations that monitor the target satellites, feed some of that up there. So the spacecraft can do it itself in many ways. It can use star trackers, inertial measurement units, or IMU. IMUs, by the way, are the same technology used in drones domestically, but that's not important. Optical cameras, infrared sensors, laser rangefinders, or LiDAR, radar, or RF sensing. And it's going to use GPS or GNSS if available in that orbital regime. A lot of ground-based tracking updates. In low Earth orbit, geometry changes very, very fast. In geosynchronous, the distances are larger, but the strategic value is enormous because geo is where all the military communication satellites live. It's where all of our missile warning satellites are parked. It's where strategic command and control satellites live. The April Cosmos 2581 and 2583 event, it matters because getting within 3 meters without collision implies a high relative navigation competence, and I'm impressed. This is the same technical family as satellite inspection, grappling, interference, or an attack. Any co-orbital ASAT, it's going to need propulsion. And I'm not talking about a huge engine, often quite the opposite, but it does need precision, repeatable, fuel-efficient maneuvering. And that would include things like a cold gas thruster, monopropellant hydrazine or hydrazine-like systems, possibly electric propulsion for a gradual orbital change, small bipropellant systems, microthrusters for fine control. So a spacecraft has to manage delta V, meaning its total maneuvering budget. Every approach, every retreat, every plane adjustment, every phasing maneuver, it all burns fuel, right? That matters because a co-orbital ASAT's useful life is partially determined by how much maneuvering energy it has left. You make too many corrections, you run out of fuel, it's really lost. So the operational art here is patience. A satellite, in many ways, it takes days or weeks to phase towards a target, but that's okay. It doesn't need to sprint. It just needs to be in place when the geopolitical moment turns. We talked a little bit about nesting doll architecture last week, and this is one of the most concerning Russian patterns, is this so-called nesting doll concept. A larger satellite releases a smaller satellite, which may itself release another object or projectile. We think we saw that this year with some of these already. And this matters because it creates a lot of layered ambiguity on our part. The parent satellite may look like a surveillance or inspection craft. Then it releases a smaller object. That object may be described as a sub-satellite inspector, a calibration object, a debris, or a test article. But it could also function as a kinetic projectile, a close inspection payload. It could function as a jammer or a grappling or contact device. It could also be a fragmentation device or a sensor package. It could just be a decoy. The military value is not only the final effect. The military value is that the target operator now has to ask, what was released, where is it going, and when does it become hostile? That ambiguity compresses decision time. It makes commanders guess under pressure. The Space Force is going to have their hands full with this one. How a co-orbital ASAT attacks does not necessarily have one kill mechanism. Okay, it has a menu of options. Kinetic impact is the simplest hard kill. It's collision. The attacking satellite or released object physically strikes the target at orbital velocity. So even a small object can be catastrophic because relative velocity in orbit is extreme. Check my notes here. Okay, I want to make sure I'm getting that right. The advantages to this are high probability of physical destruction if contact occurs. There's no need for an explosion in this type of scenario. Technically, it's very straightforward. Once close enough, you ram it. There's some disadvantages here, but they're minor. It does create a boatload of debris, which could have second and third order effects. Attribution may still be possible. There's a big risk escalation here. It may threaten the attacker's own satellites with that debris. It poisons orbital lanes. I mean, that debris is just going to circle, and that basically excludes anything else from occupying that same position in space. This is the technical equivalent of a brick through the windshield. It's crude, it's violent, and it's politically very, very loud. The other way it can do it is a projectile release. This is a much more sophisticated version of a released projectile or sub-satellite. So in this one, instead of ramming with the main spacecraft, the parent releases a smaller object on an intercept trajectory. And this allows the parent to survive, back away, or completely deny responsibility. I have no idea what happened to your satellite, Mr. President. That sounds terrible. Possible projectile types in this scenario would be an inert kinetic slug, small guided kill vehicle, some type of fragmentation device. You could even use a net or entangling mechanism. A lot of these satellites rely on solar power, and if you disrupt those, it's gone. A high-speed penetrator, or even a small explosive package. In fact, the 2020 Russian Cosmos 2542 and 2543 behavior is often cited in this context because United States officials said Russia tested a space-based anti-satellite weapon when a Russian satellite released a high-speed object. 81, 82, and 83 behavior does not prove the same thing, but it shows Russia has continued to practice a lot of complex multi-object RPO. Another option is robotic interference or grappling. So a co-orbital craft could physically interact with the target using a robotic arm, a docking probe, a clamp, a tether, or a contact mechanism. So the goal here may not be to explode the satellite. It may be just to push it off its axis or damage its solar arrays. It could foul antennas or disrupt them, right? Block any sensors, disturb attitude control, or possibly induce tumbling. You could also tamper with a lot of the thermal surfaces. These are very delicate instruments. Interfere with propulsion or docking features as well. This is especially relevant against any, high-value satellite where outright destruction could potentially be too escalatory. A mysterious malfunction is more useful than a visible act of war. So the dark beauty of this weapon is deniability, right? The satellite dies, but maybe not dramatically. Maybe it just fails. Maybe it loses attitude. Maybe it suffers a anomaly. That is how a lot of the gray zone warfare that's probably on our way in space is going to be conducted. You could sensor blind it or dazzle it, it's called. A co-orbital ASAT. It doesn't need to necessarily destroy the satellite. It can just degrade the payload. If the target is an imaging satellite, then any attack satellite could just try to dazzle optical sensors or blind the focal planes. You could interfere with calibration, contaminate the mirrors or the optical surfaces of the lens. How about just plain old obstruct line of sight so it's no longer able to see? You could point a laser or a high-intensity light source at a sensor and either block it or burn it out. You could position itself to block or confuse imagery. All of those are very attractive because it could be temporary. So that means it's reversible, which means it's deniable, right? The point is not always to kill the satellite. Sometimes the point is to blind it during a 12-hour window when armor is moving along a border, for example, or missiles are dispersing, or Navy units are repositioning. You could use a weapon that requires or involves electronic attack. It could serve as a jammer, RF interference node, and at close range, you have power requirements that could drop. A lot of small satellites near the victim can interfere with transmissions to terrestrial command links, download and upload, right? Or inter-satellite links. Some of these satellites bounce off of another one. It goes down to space. Timing signals is huge because without them, they affects telemetry and then payload data transmission. That kind of attack, it may not look like a missile strike. It may look like, signal noise or a corrupted packets, dropped links. A lot of deniability in an attack like this. Degraded command response or a temporary communications anomaly. And that's very useful operationally. You can interfere without making debris. You can escalate without, admitting escalation. Another method that could be used is cyber, spacecraft. They're basically computers with radios, with propulsion and sensors and ground links. So you can conduct cyber operations by getting close enough. All you have to do is collect emissions and then characterize command links. You could probe telemetry, exploit weak encryption, which is a little bit less likely, but it's doable. Definitely spoof signals and then gather technical intelligence for a later cyber attack. It may not be right then and there. I want to cite Secure World Foundation again, their 2026 report. It emphasizes that counter space capability. It's not just co-orbital or kinetic. It spans co-orbital, direct ascent, electronic, directed energy, and cyber. And, that's the correct frame. The kill chain for these it's blended. Space war will not be one clean weapon. It's going to be a whole host of things. It's going to be cyber, jamming, spoofing, proximity, legal pressure, commercial intimidation, and occasional hard kill options all layered together. Now, there is one we have yet to speak about, and that's a nuclear ASAT threat. Totally different weapon. Now, same strategic ecosystem, but different. A Russian co-orbital ASAT and a Russian nuclear ASAT are related strategically, but they're not the same thing, not even close. A co-orbital ASAT is a discriminating or semi-discriminating weapon. It stalks or at least attacks a specific satellite. A nuke ASAT, we're talking about a domain-wide terror weapon. It would not surgically remove one satellite. A nuclear detonation in orbit would generate radiation and EM effects that could damage broad categories of satellite across the board. I mean, commercial, allied, neutral, Russian, and Chinese. It is absolutely the nuclear option. Outer Space Treaty explicitly prohibits placing nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit. Secure World Foundation notes that if Russia placed a nuclear weapon in orbit, it would clearly violate Article 4 of the treaty. That makes the nuclear system less likely to be used casually. It is more of a hostage weapon, a way to say, if the regime or strategic deterrent is threatened, we can make low Earth orbit bleed. The co-orbital satellite is much more useful. That makes it more dangerous in day-to-day crisis management. These are strategically a lot worse than they look. Many people might be saying it's just a satellite getting close to another satellite. No, the real military effect is not just physical destruction, it's decision paralysis. A hostile satellite parked near a U.S. asset, creates 5 immediate problems. First is a warning problem. It is observing, inspecting, signaling, or preparing to attack. You don't know what it's doing. You then have an attribution problem. If the target fails, was it attacked or did it malfunction? You have an escalation problem. Does the U.S. preemptively move or jam or disable it? That brings risk, right? You have a legal problem. What counts as hostile intent in orbit? We've never defined that before. It's coming, but we don't know. You have an operational problem. Can commanders trust the satellite during a crisis? We use a lot of them. And that last one, that's huge. A satellite does not have to be destroyed to lose military value. If commanders no longer trust its feed, its timing, its link, or its survivability, then Russia has already imposed cost. Yeah. It's what Russia is probably trying to achieve. Russia's most likely objective is not space Pearl Harbor on day one. I think that would be strategically reckless on their part. Produces a lot of debris, and it's also likely to galvanize NATO. The more likely objective here for this is counter space coercion. Shadow high-value U.S. satellites, demonstrate close approach, competence, release sub-satellites to create a lot of uncertainty. Threaten commercial constellations that support Ukraine or NATO. It forces U.S. satellite operators to spend fuel maneuvering these satellites away. Definitely complicates U.S. planning. It creates huge escalation dilemmas before a terrestrial fight. Hold the U.S. system at risk. I mean, this is not only a weapons system, it is a political instrument. It is Russia telling Washington, your precision war machine has pressure points. So for this one, the bottom line is Russia's co-orbital ASAT program, it's not just about killing satellites, it's about putting a hand around the throat of the U.S. kill chain, but it's not squeezing yet. The tactic here is ambiguity, a lot of coercion. The target is it attacks our confidence. If America's military power depends on space-based timing and sensing and targeting and communication and missile warning, which it does, then Russia does not need to defeat the entire U.S. military. It only needs to make the architecture hesitate or blink or reroute or maneuver or doubt itself at the critical moment. And that's a new battlefield. Space, silent machines, a black sky, drifting closer by meters, turning orbital mechanics into political pressure. So a couple of caveats on this one. Russia denies U.S. allegations. Shocker, public orbital behavior can prove capability and suspicious geometry, but not always intent. RPO is dual use. The same technology supports legitimate inspection and servicing and repair of satellites, as well as debris removal, but it also supports hostile attack. The nuke ASAT issue, it's related, but it's distinct from ordinary co-orbital ASAT. Yeah. Okay. So let's go into briefly Recon Marines and the MXX electric dirt bike. We talked about a lot of niche tools in previous podcasts about being used by our both Recon and MARSOC. This is a story that was pretty interesting. We're going to go through this one a little quicker. The MMX, it's an electric dirt bike. So there's Recon Marines that have been training with this dirt bike. It is not a gimmick. In many ways, it is much lighter, quieter, and much more distributed, as well as harder to detect. It's better suited to Indo-Pacific reconnaissance and raids and standalone forces. Now, it is a two-wheeled vehicle, right? It's a motorcycle. It's a dirt bike. You know, we had gasoline-powered versions of these when I wore the uniform, and you had to go through a course, and there was a training pipeline, and it has applicability, but it's very niche. It is a very niche mobility tool. It does have some real advantages, but it also has some real constraints. I think the bike helps Recon Marines move farther and quieter than foot patrols, especially in terrain where JLTVs or 7 tons or even larger tactical vehicles become liability. But it's electric, so its weakness is the same as every tactical platform. You've got charging and battery, energy discipline, weight, saltwater corrosion, and how do you sustain it under field conditions? It's being tested by a Bravo Company 1st Recon Battalion, specifically its 1st Platoon, which is tied to the 15th MEU. Tested and prepared to deploy with 8 of these bikes after doing some training at Pendleton, 29 Palms, Yuma, Washington, and Alaska. So they're really testing it in a variety of climate places. They're also expecting to test it in wet jungle environments such as the Philippines. Now, they've been experimenting with these MMX as a tactical mobility layer for reconnaissance and raid forces for a while now. There is some official imagery out there, so if you're interested in seeing what these look like, it's on the open source. It's not anything that you would recognize a form factor of. This goes back to 2023. A lot of training that was done by 1st Recon and supporting elements for raid forces and land-based limited scale raids were being used as far back as then. You've got a pretty mature technology here. They've parachuted using LCADs, a low-cost aerial delivery system, which is basically a GPS-guided parachute that you can put out of aircraft, and it will automatically steer to its destination. It's useful to pre-position equipment, a supply drop, but one that is smart instead of dumb. So they've dropped it out of planes from KC-130s using JPADs, and that demonstrates expeditionary logistics. Can it be inserted with the force? Can you jump in with it? Not just driven from a parking lot. It's built around a very low signature movement. You have no exhaust, very quiet electric drive. There's no fuel smell. Of course, instant torque. If you've ever driven an electric anything, it is incredibly torquey, which is good and bad. I think it's going to get folks into trouble pretty quick, but could also get them out of it. Has quick swappable battery packs. That's pretty cool. So direct drive gearing. There's no chain. There's no belt. I haven't looked at it in great detail, but it looks like it might be shaft driven. I'm not exactly sure. Could be gear as well. I don't know. Air-cooled motor. Because it's electric, there's no transmission, which means a much greater reduced maintenance burden. There's no oil. There's no two-stroke mix. There's no gas. There's no fluids or anything. If you go onto Zero's military page, they also say the MXX has a 1 meter submersion capability. That's pretty cool. And some wet weather operation features. So why does Recon want it? Simple, Pacific. The Pacific's a terrain problem. If you've ever been in dense jungle or island interiors or soft beaches or narrow roads, littoral terrain, and they punish heavy vehicles. And foot movement is slow and sloggy. So there's a niche here for it. The JLTV is survivable, but this is a big, noisy, and very logistically hungry vehicle. It's also hard to hide. 7-ton, even worse. And a recon team does not need to arrive like a parade. Doesn't want to be in a 7-ton. It needs to appear, sense, report, and then disappear. So task and purpose, if you're not familiar with them, check them out. They quoted Bravo Company Commander Captain Jonathan Bender saying large vehicles like the JTLV and the 7-ton, they won't maneuver as intended in dense jungle environments. Yeah, no shit. While dirt bikes, they do give a lot of access to terrain that would otherwise be deniable to these platforms. He also emphasized quieter operations, smaller heat signature against some of these peer threats. And that fits directly into the Marine Corps broader force design logic. Recon, I think, is not just, looking around. I think they're becoming part of the targeting architecture. You find the ship, find the missile battery, find the radar, confirm the landing site, confirm the route, pass the data, survive long enough to do it again. And the tactical meaning is the MMX gives recon Marines up a middle option between walking and using a vehicle column. On foot, a team is quiet, but slow and physically limited. And of course, on the other side of the house in trucks, you've got much faster mobility, but you're louder, you're hotter, easier to detect, much more tied to, roads and trails. So this is that middle ground. It fills the seams. 2 Marines can move fast, super low signature over a lot of broken terrain. And then you can cache the bikes and then go on foot towards the final objective. USNI reported Marines talking exactly in those terms. These can be staged and cached, and then smaller bike elements can push closer before caching the bikes again and going on foot. Marines also describe the value of 2 recon Marines covering ground with a lower signature than multiple trucks. They likened the mission set to it's not charge into battle on dirt bikes. It's more, route reconnaissance in support of a larger force, or raid movement where you need a lot of speed and a lot of silence. Maybe Overwatch insertion for a scout sniper or a JTAC, littoral island movements after insertion from amphibious shipping. It allows for a lot of rapid displacement after a team has compromised its position. If you need it to, it's a quick way to E&E. And you can airdrop these things, and they're aviation supported. That's pretty cool. Marines are considering scout leader 2-man elements, possibly with snipers or JTACs, and then you use these bikes for overwatch and route clearance at a distance. This is, again, big amphibious assault force, moving away from that more towards distributed sensing and striking nodes. I think there's a lot of utility here. I think this says a lot of things as well. It says that the advanced reconnaissance vehicle is being developed for littoral mobility with advanced sensing and communications, but the MMX, it's much smaller than those programs. So philosophically, it belongs to the same family, which is mobility for small teams operating inside of contested space. Bike doesn't kill ships. It doesn't replace aircraft. It's not going to replace drones. It just moves humans and sensors through terrains where heavier platforms leave too much signature. And that's the point. There's some advantages and there's some disadvantages. And real quick, right? Advantages. It's quiet. You have a low acoustic signature here. Very, very nice at night where sound discipline is survival. There's a much greater reduced thermal and exhaust signature. Yeah, they're still going to show heat under thermal, but a lot less than a gas engine. And there's no hot exhaust or fuel smell or engine idle plume. And that's important when you're going against drones and thermal sites and listening posts. Another advantage is terrain access. They're eligible to exploit narrow trails, a lot of sandy terrain and vegetation, small gaps, stuff like that. You can rapidly deploy with a very low manpower. A 2-man element can cover more ground than a foot patrol, that's for sure. Very simple mechanical operations. There's no clutch, no gears, no kickstart, very reduced fluids, and very few, or fewer, I should say, traditional engine maintenance requirements. So, mostly battery charging requirements, chain lube. Okay, so maybe it is chain driven. It doesn't make any sense. That's not what they said earlier. I'll have to go back and check that one. I'll report on the next one. Better compatibility with distributed operations because you can pair them with MRZRs, ULTVs, C-130s, amphibious shipping, and then small unit sustainments. Now, disadvantages and hard limits. The battery range is mission dependent. USNI reported Marines could get roughly 80 miles in milder terrain with new batteries, maybe 60 to 70 with older batteries, but really hard riding, you drop that down to around 30. My Tesla advertises 340, and that's not what I get. So a lot of that has to do with my extraordinarily aggressive driving, but that's neither confirmed nor denied. Well, there have also been reported cases where the bikes were drained in about 20 minutes under hard use. And combat load kills range, right? Recon Marines, they're not motocross riders in a jersey and a helmet. You know, they've got armor, weapons, radios, batteries, water, optics, med gear, and mission essential equipment. So weight's going to steal a lot of that range. Every pound becomes a lot of drag and heat. Charging is a huge tactical vulnerability. I mean, at least with gas engines, logistics are ugly. You got to get the fuel there somehow, but once it is, man, refueling is fast. Whereas charging is going to require a lot of time, battery swaps, support vehicles, or maybe even solar system. I don't know. That's going to require some planning, friction, and a potential signature that goes with it. Saltwater and shipboard integrations, those are real problems right now. USNI has reported Marines expected corrosion concerns at sea, noted the lithium-ion batteries, and they could pose a hazmat problem. I'll tell you, Navy shipping is very sensitive to anything that could set fire, explode, leak in any form and fashion. Being deployed on a Navy ship with small boats like the Zodiac, all of our fuel were stored outside the skin of the ship on jettison racks. In the event that it caught fire, the whole rack would be jettisoned into the sea. You wouldn't even bother putting out the fire. And, you know, lithium ions are the same way. If anybody has flown an airplane and you have to check a bag, the first thing they do is want you to identify whether you have any lithium ion batteries or rechargeable batteries in your bag. It's not silent enough against a prepared adversary. Quiet doesn't mean invisible. You still have tires and suspension and chain movements. You have rider movements, dust, thermal bloom, electromagnetic transmissions or emissions from any of the gear. And yeah, drone surveillance is still going to expose the team. There's also a casualty and recovery problem. I mean, a motorcycle gives mobility, but it doesn't protect the rider. And this is one of the reasons why we kind of started getting away from the gas-powered versions of these back in the day. If a Marine wrecks or it gets hit or the bike fails in deep terrain, you now have a recovery burden. It requires a lot of rider skill, okay? Instant torque is useful, but man, does it punish people who don't have motorcycle experience. So the training pipeline is going to be robust, I would say. I would definitely feel that that's going to be something that comes online faster than the deployment does. What does this say to our adversaries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea? I don't know. It's another data point. I think they're looking at how we're revising our Marine Corps and probably taking interest in it, probably following our example in some cases. I mean, we're showing that we're serious about a small, mobile, low signature reconnaissance platform that can operate inside of contested areas. For China specifically, I think the implication is obvious. I think if they're paying attention, they're seeing that the Marine Corps is preparing Marines to move through island terrain, jungle corridors, littoral zones, a lot of austere expeditionary sites inside the first island chain. The 15th Muse 2024 Indo-Pacific employment included training with Philippine and South Korean Marines, and that sits squarely inside that broader regional logic. So really interesting technology. Last week, we talked about the powered paragliders, and this week we're talking about electric motorcycles. I think that whatever side finds first, hides better, and moves cleaner gets to shoot first or avoid being shot. And that's one of the things that this solves. I mean, the Marine Corps is trying to solve a pretty brutal equation. How do you put humans close enough to sense and verify the battle space without making them dead men walking? Especially as you operate under a drone or a satellite or a SIGINT threat that's getting worse and worse. The MMX is one answer. It is not the answer, but it is a answer. We'll follow up with this and systems like this as they progress more and more into the inventory. As I said, we had the gasoline versions of this. As a team leader, I was reluctant to use them because of, just the noise signature, the mobility signature, and they just had a record for hurting people. So I do agree that there is a niche for these, and there's a lot of advantages, but man, there's a ton of advantages too. So I would imagine that leadership is probably looking at these with some very careful mission planning parameters and limited case use, but case nonetheless. All right. We've had a long episode, and I told you that it was going to be because there's a lot to discuss. I will leave you with one more story for this evening. And as we visit that little despot in Northern Korea Peninsula, good old Kim, I was thinking about this story, and I cannot talk about North Korea without talking about Team America. I really wish that Matt and Trey would do Team America Part 2 so we can revisit the latest leaders in this ridiculous world stage we have. I was not a fan of Team America when it first came out. I had to watch it more than a couple of times before I thought better of it and realized the genius behind it, or at least that's funny as fuck. Yeah, but it did come to grow on me, and we've had so many fresh people that we could parody. There absolutely has to be another one. So North Korea recently changed its stance towards South Korea. Their current stance towards South Korea is not just more hostile rhetoric. It is a formal strategic break. Pyongyang is now trying to bury the old fiction that the two Koreas are one temporarily divided nation. They're trying to replace it with a much harder doctrine. Two separate hostile states, one nuclear armed, with South Korea treated as a permanent adversary, rather than a future compatriot. This matters because it definitely lowers the political cost of escalation. If South Koreans are no longer brothers to be reunified, they become an enemy population that is attached to an enemy state. That is the psychological and legal groundwork for coercion, gray zone attacks, border militarization, and honestly, nuclear brinkmanship. North Korea has revised its constitution recently to remove reference to Korean unification. It is now defining its territory as bordering the Republic of Korea to the south, while Kim Jong-un has publicly called South Korea the most hostile state. Reuters reports that Kim had called in January of 2024 for the Constitution to identify South Korea as the North's primary foe and invariable principal enemy. That's in quotes. And South Korean officials now assess that Pyongyang has embedded the two hostile states doctrine into its highest law. At the same time, North Korea is expanding both nuclear and conventional coercive tools. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, which is responsible for that region, has confirmed multiple DPRK ballistic missile launches on April 7th and 8th of this year, while saying the launches did not pose an immediate threat to the United States personnel, territory, or allies. And that's fair. They've got some work to do before that's going to take place. Not that they're not a threat, just they're not as big of a range as I think Kim wants. He's vowed to permanently strengthen North Korea's nuclear forces. He has absolutely rejected the idea of trading nuclear disarmament for economic or security benefits, and he has warned South Korea of a merciless response to infringements on North Korean sovereignty. The blunt read here is that Kim is not preparing for reconciliation. He is preparing for durable confrontation under a nuclear shield. So what changed? Well, reunification is being erased, and that's pretty important because for decades, both Koreas claimed, at least formally anyways, that they represented the legitimate future of the entire peninsula. North Korea's new constitutional posture completely breaks with that inherited framework. Reuters reported on May 6th of this year that North Korea revised its constitution to define its territory as bordering South Korea, remove all references to reunification. Euronews, citing South Korea's unification ministry, reported that the old clause about realizing the unification of the motherland no longer appears in the latest constitution, while the new text says North Korea borders China and Russia to the north, Republic of Korea to the south. That's an important nuance. There has been reporting that the amended constitution apparently does not use the words hostile or belligerent inside the territorial clause itself, even though Kim has repeatedly used that framing politically since declaring in 23 that inter-Korean relationships have become relations between two hostile states. It's a nuance, but it matters. Pyongyang is, I think, trying to do two things at once. They're legally normalizing permanent division while politically preserving the ability to escalate against Seoul as an enemy. That's not moderation. That is a cleaner doctrine, and that's Kim's doctrine, right? South Korea is no longer family. It's a target state. Kim's March speech of this year to the Supreme People's Assembly made that line very, very explicit. This is coming from Reuters. Kim said North Korea would permanently strengthen its nuclear forces, called its nuclear arms status irreversible, and said South Korea had been recognized as the most hostile state. That's the strategic center of gravity here, folks. North Korea is now denying South Korea's legitimacy as a national counterpart. That is new. That is a change. Reuters cited South Korean analysts saying the language strips South Korea of its remaining status as a compatriot nation and goes far beyond ordinary anti-Seoul rhetoric. Some people are going to call that propaganda, and they're right. I mean, in many ways, it is propaganda. But propaganda is also architecture. I mean, regimes build permission structures before they take dangerous action. That's precedent. And Kim is clearly building one. Their military posture is very layered. It's not singular. You know, North Korea doesn't rely on one coercive lever. It's building a massive full spectrum pressure stack. I don't know to what end, but nuclear deterrence and coercion is one of them. Kim says North Korea's nuclear status is completely irreversible. It probably is. And that nuclear weapons are essential to regime survival. And again, it probably is. But Reuters is reporting that North Korea's 26 budget allocates defense spending to expanding nuclear deterrence and warfighting capabilities. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command has confirmed multiple ballistic missile launches. We said that one, and it reiterated U.S. commitment to defending the homeland and regional allies. There's a huge artillery threat, if you know anything about this. Massive, massive artillery on the north sides. The artillery threat to Seoul is incredible. Associated Press reported on the 8th of May that North Korea says it will deploy new long-range 155 millimeter self-propelled guns this year, all capable of striking South Korea's capital region, with Kim saying the system has a range of over 60 kilometers. That's pretty robust. And that's Seoul, with around 10 million people sitting roughly 40 to 50 kilometers from the border. They're also modernizing their Navy. The Associated Press is reporting that Kim reviewed the destroyer Chao Hong and ordered it handed over to the Navy in mid-June, calling it part of North Korea's larger naval modernization push. There's a lot of gray zone and non-kinetic pressure from them as well. North Korea has used trash balloons, a lot of those, GPS spoofing, electronic jamming, and also a lot of cyber activity against South Korea. 38 North publication that notes that these non-kinetic provocations have created a lot of response problems because the armistice, and remember, there's no ceasefire between the Koreas. There's just an armistice. The rules of engagement under that armistice were not designed for these type of asymmetrical pressures. There was no way to anticipate GPS spoofing or trash balloons or some of the other cyber attacks that they're conducting. CSIS assessed that the trash balloon campaign, for example, was less a sign of imminent war and more an expression of Kim's decoupling policy and a counter to South Korea's unification messaging around freedom and human rights. And that's not random noise. That's a lot of escalation management. You annoy your adversary, intimidate, you normalize friction, and he's doing it, right? You're testing and probing how they're going to respond, Seoul in this case, and it keeps Seoul politically off balance. Russia also, it's changing a lot of North Korea's confidence level. I think the Russian relationship between Kim and Vladimir, call him Vladimir. Reuters reports on May 8th that Kim has reaffirmed North Korea's commitment to its mutual defense treaty with Russia and called Russia's partnership a top priority. The 2024 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty includes a mutual defense provision. I don't know how that one's going to play out. The U.S. intelligence community assesses that North Korea's support for Russia in Ukraine has increased North Korea's capabilities because its forces have gained a lot of combat experience. Their forces have also gotten fucked up quite a bit as well, but gain combat experience in 21st century warfare, as well as exposure to some of this new equipment that North Korea's military doesn't currently have. Reuters also reported that North Korea sent an estimated 14,000 troops to fight with Russian forces in Kirks, and that South Korean, Ukrainian, and Western officials say more than 6,000 were killed. That casualty figure is brutal, but the lesson for Kim is not simply loss, it's adaptation. North Korean officers and planners are likely absorbing lessons on drones, artillery, electronic warfare, casualty tolerance, battlefield surveillance, and massing under modern precision fires. That should worry Seoul, because North Korea is no longer just rehearsing war on its own training grounds. It's now learning from an active European war. South Korea's problem right now is deterrence without panic. Their government has tried to reopen space for dialogue unsuccessfully. Reuters reported that North Korea has rebuffed repeated overtures from Lee's administration. And Associated Press reported that Seoul's liberal government took preemptive steps to ease tensions, including shutting down propaganda broadcasts along the border. But North Korea has continued to shun the dialogue with both South Korea and the United States. I don't know where Dennis Rodman fits into all this, but I haven't heard from him in a while. That leaves Seoul in a hard box because if it overreacts, it feeds Pyongyang's narrative of hostile encirclement. If it underreacts, it teaches Pyongyang that a lot of these gray zone pressures that they're employing, it works. There's also a domestic political layer. South Korea is still operating under the shadow of a very turbulent recent political debacle under this martial law debates and some constitutional reforms. Reuters reports on May 8th that South Korea's parliament dropped the constitutional amendment vote tied to tightening martial law rules after an opposition filibuster. For North Korea, South Korea domestic division, it's not background noise. It's a very exploitable scene. So what does North Korea want? Well, I don't know what he really wants, but what the signals say is that he wants to end reunification as a South-led or liberal democratic threat. Pyongyang no longer wants its population thinking of South Korea as wealthy cousins across the border. It wants South Korea recoded as enemy territory. It forces recognition of North Korea as a permanent nuclear state. Kim's rejecting denuclearization for benefits. The ask is no longer pay us to freeze. The message is accept us as nuclear and negotiate from there. It splits Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo. That's another objective that the North is obviously seeking in this. Pyongyang benefits when South Korea doubts U.S. extended deterrence. Japan rearms in ways that trigger Korean historical anxieties, and Washington is clearly distracted elsewhere. He wants to exploit Russia and China without becoming fully dependent on either. Russia has given North Korea battlefield experience, diplomatic cover, a lot of technical benefits, and sanctions leakage. China is remaining as an economic lifeline because China does not want millions of North Korean refugees pouring across the border being absorbed by China. They'll do anything to keep Kim exactly in doing what he's always been doing. So Kim Jong-un wants both. He wants autonomy more than anything, though. The other objective, at least from all intents and purposes, to keep the peninsula permanently tense below the threshold of full war. Tension is useful. Full war is existential. The sweet spot is controlled danger because he can constantly sell it to his people as existential threat. All of this applies militarily is that the near-term risk is not a deliberate North Korean full-scale invasion. That remains pretty unlikely unless Kim believes his very survival is already at stake. No, the more realistic danger is managed confrontation that perhaps misfires. Flashpoints could include the Northern Limit Line or the Yellow Sea. This one remains one of the most dangerous friction zones because maritime boundaries between the two countries are disputed. Units operate very, very closely in that space, and incidents can escalate pretty quickly. Drone incursions and airspace claims. Yonhap reported in April that North Korea accused South Korea of drone incursions between September and January, and warned Seoul that they would pay a high price. Whatever. 3 individuals, including an NIS employee and a military officer, were reportedly indicted after an investigation. This is exactly the type of issue that become a casus belli in Pyongyang's narrative machine. Artillery positioning near the border. These new 155 millimeter systems are politically useful, even if not revolutionary. They remind Seoul that North Korea can threaten civilian centers immediately, not just with missiles or nukes, cyber, and electronic warfare. The U.S. intelligence community assessed in 2026 that North Korea's cyber program is very sophisticated and very agile, and North Korea continues to threaten the United States and our allies through WMD, conventional, cyber, and asymmetric warfare. The hard truth is Seoul's vulnerability is not just military. It is psychological. North Korea's strategy is to make South Korea live inside a permanent low-grade emergency. U.S., this is no longer a narrow Korea problem. This is part of a broader authoritarian alignment problem. You have North Korea, you have Russia, you have China, and Iran. Each operate differently, but they increasingly learn from one another or provide diplomatic cover or create simultaneous pressure points. The U.S. intelligence community assessed that China, Russia, and North Korea all see the United States as a strategic competitor and potential adversary. It also assessed that North Korea's weapons of mass destruction, conventional military capabilities, cyber, and willingness to use asymmetric capabilities threaten the United States and our allies, particularly South Korea and Japan. If you've ever done any work with the U.S. ROC Japan, ROC Marines, they rely heavily on the United States, and they're very capable, but they also live under the constant awareness that DMZ would be overrun in pretty quick order if the North Koreans just got a wild hair up their ass and came across the border. So they very much rely on the United States and Japan, and that triangle becomes much more important in this context, not less. But that triangle has a vulnerability threat, and that is history. North Korea and China both understand that South Korea and Japan defense cooperation has a lot of political limits. Expect Pyongyang to amplify any issue that drives a wedge between Seoul and Tokyo. North Korea is not signaling imminent invasion. It is signaling permanent separation under nuclear protection. That is worse than a temporary crisis. In one sense, it becomes the new normal. Crisis burns hot and ends. Doctrine hardens. Kim is hardening the doctrine. The mistake would be to assume this is only bluster. The opposite mistake would be to assume war is inevitable. I think the correct read here is probably colder. North Korea is building a legal, ideological, and military framework for coercive confrontation while preserving enough ambiguity to avoid triggering a decisive Allied response. That's the blade. Not war tomorrow. A peninsula trained to accept the smell of smoke. Some key caveats on this one. North Korean state media. It is controlled and often performative. Oh my God, is it performative? I cannot get enough of that crazy bitch who reads the North Korean news. That is one of my favorite ways to wake up in the morning. KCNA reported military claims should be treated as political and military signaling unless independently verified. Now, the Associated Press explicitly notes that KCNA images from Kim's recent inspections could not be independently verified. The constitutional language I have mentioned is still being interpreted through South Korean official and media review. So, some outlets emphasize the hostile state doctrine, while Hank Yori notes that the specific amended text reportedly avoids the words hostile and belligerent. The most dangerous variable is not capability alone, it's miscalculation. A drone flight or maritime encounter or, GPS interference episode, an artillery drill, or even domestic political crisis that convinces one side or the other is preparing for something larger. So, any changes in any of the aforementioned segments, we will report. I appreciate your support. As a matter of fact, without you, our program, our show, our projects, our passions would not be as able to be manifested as they are. So thank you to all of you for listening. Thank you for your support, your comments, your questions, your challenges. I welcome them all. And until next week, this is me, Brad Colbert, the Iceman, reminding all of you to stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and